What if Earth once knew something and forgot? What if before oceans learned their names, before rock learned how to stay still, before light found a surface to rest upon, there was already a memory forming, quiet, unfinished, drifting between sparks of dust and gravity? Wherever you are tonight, I'm glad you're here. This story does not hurry. It does not explain. It listens. It listens to a time before Earth could speak for itself, when the solar system was not a family of worlds but a breath still deciding how deep to go. Tonight, the planet remembers its own becoming, slowly, gently, like falling asleep inside a very old thought. What if Earth once knew something and forgot? The question does not arrive loudly. It drifts, like dust that has not yet decided where to land. In the long before names learned how to stay attached to things, there was no Earth, not even the idea of one. There was only a cloud, vast, unlit, uncentered, spreading itself thin across a quiet region of a galaxy that had already forgotten how many times it had begun before. This cloud did not glow, it did not announce itself. It simply existed, cold and patient, holding within it the remains of older fires. Ashes of stars that had burned until they could not remember how to keep their shape. Hydrogen floated there, light enough to believe it might never settle. Helium followed, slightly heavier, slightly more willing to linger. Between them drifted specks of carbon, oxygen, silicon, grains so small they could pass through emptiness without changing it. Nothing here hurried. Motion existed, but it was aimless, like breathing in sleep. No direction, no destination, just presence. Time, in this place, did not pass. It waited. The cloud did not know it was a beginning. It had no language for origin. It only carried a quiet imbalance, so slight it could be mistaken for nothing at all. Somewhere within its sprawl, density leaned just a little higher, a subtle gathering, not enough to be noticed, not enough to matter, yet. Gravity, at first, was not a pull. It was a suggestion, a barely felt invitation, asking matter to consider togetherness. Particles drifted closer, then apart again, unsure whether staying would mean losing themselves. Nothing forced them, nothing commanded collapse. The universe here was gentle. It had learned patience from things that failed too quickly. Cold ruled this place, but it was not hostile. Cold preserved. Cold slowed the urge to react. It allowed memory to remain intact inside atoms that had already lived other lives. Each grain carried a story older than the cloud itself, a supernova's final breath, a star's long exhaustion, light scattered into silence. These stories were not told, they were stored. The cloud did not remember them, but it held them anyway. Somewhere deep inside, pressure began to gather, not suddenly, not dramatically, just enough to make stillness uncomfortable. Hydrogen atoms brushed past one another more often now. Collisions increased, not as violence but as familiarity. Paths crossed, then crossed again. The cloud was learning repetition. Repetition is how time begins to feel real. Still, nothing shone, nothing burned. There was no center yet, only regions that leaned toward becoming one. The future sun was not a star at this point. It was a question without urgency. Could enough matter agree to stay close? Could closeness last? Around this forming uncertainty, the rest of the cloud watched without awareness. There was no audience here, no witnesses, just matter slowly deciding whether solitude was sustainable. In the quiet, temperature rose by fractions too small to celebrate. Pressure increased, but without sound. If there had been ears, they would have heard nothing. Creation does not announce itself when it is unsure. The cloud thickened, not everywhere, only where it mattered. Gravity's whisper became a murmur, still gentle, still forgiving, but more persistent now. Particles that drifted away found themselves slowing, curving back as if reconsidering. Paths bent, straight lines grew rare. Motion began to circle rather than flee. This was not collapse, this was consent. Dust grains began to shadow one another, briefly blocking the faint background light of the galaxy beyond. Darkness deepened, not as absence but as layering. The cloud folded in on itself slowly enough that nothing tore. Pressure warmed the core just enough to matter. Not enough to ignite, only enough to remember. Inside this warming pocket, time thickened. Seconds lost their sharpness. Moments stretched. The cloud was no longer evenly spread. It was becoming uneven, textured, capable of difference. Difference is the first sign of story. Far from this growing center, the cloud remained untouched, indifferent. Most of it would never become anything else. Most beginnings do not succeed. The universe accepts this without grief. But near the center, matter leaned harder now. Gravity no longer asked. It waited, knowing patience would eventually be enough. The future solar system existed here only as tension, between falling inward and drifting apart, between heat and cold, between memory and forgetting. Earth was nowhere yet, not even as dust with intention, but the ingredients that would one day ache to become surface and ocean were already present. Drifting in the dark, unaware they were rehearsing permanence, time did not pass. It gathered. And somewhere in that gathering the cloud began to dream, not of planets or light or life, but of weight, of staying, of becoming difficult to move. Some truths are not created, they are slowly allowed. The cloud did not wake when gravity deepened. It had never been asleep. What changed was not awareness, but texture. The interior grew denser, the way silence does when it listens to itself for too long. Particles that once passed without consequence now lingered. Their encounters left impressions, not marks, not scars, but tendencies. Where matter met matter, it hesitated before separating again. That hesitation mattered. Heat began to accumulate, but not like flame. It was warmth without light, pressure without sound. The kind of warmth that only exists when escape becomes difficult. Hydrogen moved faster now, not because it wished to, but because confinement asked more of it. Motion became restless. Paths shortened. Space inside the cloud slowly forgot how wide it had once been. This was not the birth of the sun, not yet. This was the long thought before the word. Around the thickening center, the cloud flattened, not by design, but by consequence. Rotation, once insignificant, gained influence. What had been a vague turning became a preference. Matter began to orbit the growing density, circling rather than falling straight in. This circling was not stability, it was compromise. Gravity allowed motion as long as motion agreed to stay nearby. The cloud was no longer symmetrical, it was learning imbalance. Dust grains, heavier than gas, responded differently. They resisted being carried away. They settled into the forming disk, tracing faint rings around the warm core. Each ring held slightly different stories, different temperatures, different futures. None of them knew this. They simply followed what felt easiest. Time, here, grew viscous. Moments stuck to one another. Inside the densest region, pressure rose enough to begin erasing choice. Hydrogen atoms crowded together, jostling, colliding, compressing. Their individual histories blurred. Identity thinned. Something ancient stirred, not excitement, not urgency, but inevitability. The conditions for fusion were not met yet, but they were being approached, like a shoreline appearing slowly through fog. The cloud did not celebrate this approach, it endured it. Around the forming core, the disk stretched outward, thin and wide, carrying with it the future of things that would never touch the sun directly. Here, temperatures varied gently. Some regions remained cold enough to preserve ice, water, methane, ammonia, frozen into dust grains that carried more memory than heat. These ices were not water yet. They were possibility without shape. Other regions grew warmer, too warm for ice to remain. Volatiles drifted away. Only rock and metal stayed. Iron dust, silicates, calcium, aluminum, heavy elements forged long ago in dying stars now finding themselves near a new one that had not yet learned how to shine. This separation was quiet. No boundary announced itself, yet futures diverged. Closest to the center, matter learned endurance through heat. Farther out, it learned patience through cold. The solar system was not yet a system, but it was already sorting itself to see, deciding which materials would remember fire and which would remember darkness. The growing proto-sun pressed inward, compressing itself further. Atoms lost space between them. Temperature rose until it was no longer merely warmth, but pressure becoming something else. A threshold approached, one that would not allow reversal. Still nothing exploded. Nothing rushed. The universe rarely begins with certainty. It tests, adjusts, waits. The cloud's slow collapse was not a fall, but a folding. Layers of matter wrapped inward, carrying with them dust, memory, and the faint radioactive ticking of isotopes that would one day measure time for rocks and bones. These isotopes did not know they were clocks. They only decayed, faithfully. The disk surrounding the core grew thinner, flatter, faster. Rotation quickened as distance shrank. Conservation whispered its rules without explanation. Motion became organized without ever being planned. The cloud, once formless, now carried structure like a rumor. In the densest regions of the disk, dust grains brushed often enough to cling. Electrostatic forces helped. So did chance. Tiny clumps formed, broke apart, formed again. Nothing lasted long, but the idea of staying together had entered the conversation. This was rehearsal, not creation, not yet. The proto-sun neared ignition, but the story did not center there. It lingered in the surrounding disk, where futures waited without knowing what they were waiting for, where Earth's earliest ingredients drifted without gravity strong enough to name them, where nothing was stable, but everything was becoming more likely. Silence deepened as structure increased. The more ordered the cloud became, the quieter it felt. Chaos makes noise, organization absorbs it. The solar system was learning how to hold itself without tearing apart. It practiced balance long before it practiced brilliance, and in that practice something subtle took root, not intention, not destiny, but memory. Memory of motion, memory of warmth, memory of staying near something long enough to be changed by it. Somewhere inside this flattening disk, matter that would one day become continents, oceans, and air circled patiently, not as Earth, not even as promise, only as dust learning how to wait. What begins as fire must first learn stillness. Before light, there was pressure. Before pressure, there was patience. At the center of the folding cloud, patience thinned. Density climbed until space itself felt crowded. Hydrogen atoms pressed so close that their distances lost meaning. Motion became frantic, not with fear but with necessity. There was nowhere left to drift without touching something else. Temperature rose again, quietly crossing thresholds that had no names yet. The proto-sun held itself together through insistence rather than strength. Gravity did not pull harder. It simply refused to let go. Inside, a boundary approached, one that did not announce itself. When it arrived, nothing looked different from the outside. There was no flash, no sudden star. Fusion began the way memory does, uncertain whether it will last. A few hydrogen nuclei merged, briefly overcoming their repulsion. Helium appeared, fragile and fleeting. Energy escaped as neutrinos and photons that vanished into the surrounding matter, warming it rather than illuminating it. The sun did not turn on. It learned to breathe. Each successful fusion made the next more likely. Pressure pushed outward as gravity pressed inward. Balance emerged not as peace, but as tension held without breaking. The core stabilized just enough to persist. Light, still trapped, had not yet learned how to leave. Around this unseen furnace, the disk responded. Heat radiated outward, gently rewriting the fates of materials nearby. Ices retreated. Rocks endured. The line between them shifted, breathing in and out as luminosity wavered. Nothing here was fixed. Everything adjusted. The solar system was now anchored, not by brightness, but by continuity. The protosun's steady output began to clear its surroundings. Solar wind, thin, relentless, pushed lighter gases away, sculpting the disk's edges. This was not violence, it was refinement. Only what could endure proximity remained close. The rest drifted outward, carrying untouched memory into the dark. Within the disk, dust clumps grew bolder. Collisions became more frequent. Some shattered, some stuck. Static forces gave way to gravity, tiny at first, then slightly less so. Pebbles formed, then stones. Each carried the layered histories of countless earlier grains, compressed into new shapes. These stones did not know they were forgetting how to be stars. They only grew heavier. Rotation guided them into lanes. Paths cleared as some orbits grew crowded and others empty. The disk was no longer uniform. It had scars, gaps, density waves. Signs of motion learning preference. The solar system was becoming selective long before consciousness existed to notice. The young sun brightened incrementally, not enough to dominate, but enough to matter. Light began to escape the core, filtering through layers of gas and dust. It was dim, reddish, uncertain, but it lasted. And lasting changed everything. Time now had a reference point. With light came shadows. With warmth came gradients. Materials sorted themselves not by intention but by endurance. Close to the sun, metals and silicates dominated, clinging to solid form despite heat. Farther out, ices survived, thickening bodies that would one day grow immense. Between these regions, Earth's future waited, not yet assembled, not yet aware. Its ingredients passed each other endlessly, colliding, breaking, reforming. Nothing stayed whole for long, but mass accumulated. Gravity whispered louder now, encouraging clumps to remember one another. Some bodies grew faster than others. Their increased gravity altered nearby paths, stealing material, clearing lanes. These were the early protoplanets, not planets yet, but ambitions. They shaped the disk without asking permission. Collisions grew heavier, slower, more consequential. Energy released as heat, melting surfaces briefly before space reclaimed it. Each impact rearranged memory. Each fragment carried the story of violence endured without language. The solar system learned its first lesson in permanence here. To exist is to survive impact. As the sun stabilized further, its rhythm became reliable. Fusion settled into a steady exhale. Light strengthened, reaching farther, pushing boundaries outward. The disk thinned as material was either claimed by growing bodies or blown away into interstellar silence. The cloud that had once been everything was now a structure with a center, a plane and an edge. What remained beyond drifted away, forgotten by the system it had helped create. Most beginnings are abandoned. What stayed began to remember itself as distinct, not named, not aware, but different enough to matter. The solar system, once a hesitation, now carried direction. Time moved forward not as change but as accumulation. Earth was still absent, but the space where Earth could exist was no longer empty. Some truths are not born in light. They are tempered in pressure, shaped by collision, and allowed to cool slowly enough to endure. And as the disk continued its quiet labour, gathering stones that had once been dust, the story leaned toward weight, not collapse, not chaos, but the gravity of staying. The cloud no longer remembered its edges. What had once spread thin across a quiet reach of space had folded inward so gradually that the act felt less like collapse and more like forgetting distance. The outer regions drifted away, released without ceremony. They carried with them fragments of the beginning, untouched, unchosen, still light enough to wander forever. No grief followed them. The universe does not mourn what remains unfinished. What stayed learned density. At the center, pressure and heat had settled into a patient balance. Not a triumph, not an arrival, just a condition that could last. The protosun breathed steadily now, not bright enough to command attention, but consistent enough to matter. Its warmth reached outward in quiet waves, teaching nearby matter the difference between enduring and escaping. Around this steady core, the disk thinned further, its once chaotic motions smoothing into preference. Orbits became habits, paths repeated often enough to feel familiar. The system did not know itself as a system, but it had learned coherence, the art of staying organized without effort. Dust had become stone. Stone had begun to remember weight. Grains that once scattered at the slightest disturbance now resisted motion. They pressed inward when they met, held together by gravity that had finally grown confident enough to insist. These stones were not large. Many would never grow beyond fragments. But each one marked a threshold crossed, the moment matter stopped asking whether it should remain and simply did. Temperature gradients stabilized. Regions closer to the central warmth surrendered their ices, leaving behind materials that could tolerate fire without becoming it. Farther out, cold preserved what heat could not. The solar system learned contrast. It learned that difference did not require separation. Time now felt directional. Not because it rushed forward, but because it could no longer reverse without undoing too much. Processes layered, changes stacked. Memory began to accumulate not in awareness, but in structure, in isotopes decaying quietly, in orbits repeating faithfully, in mass bending space in ways that could not be ignored. The cloud's original softness was gone. In its place stood something firmer, more reluctant to change. Weight had arrived, not as heaviness, but as commitment. Matter had chosen to remain near itself long enough to be altered by that decision. This was the first inheritance. Nothing living would ever remember this moment. No surface would preserve its exact shape. Yet every future thing born here would carry its consequences. The direction of spin, the division of materials, the distance between warmth and cold. These were not designed. They were remembered. Silence deepened again. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of systems that have settled into rhythm. Motion continued everywhere, but without noise. The solar system, still young, still fragile, had learned how to hold itself without tearing apart. The protosun continued its quiet labour at the centre. Fusing without spectacle, breathing without pause, it did not yet shine with confidence. But it endured, and endurance is how stories begin to last. Around it, stones circled. Some collided and broke, some merged and grew. Nothing yet could claim permanence. But the conditions for permanence were no longer absent. They hovered, waiting to be used. The cloud that once dreamed of weight had awakened into it. What had been diffuse was now structured. What had been hesitant was now committed. What had been possibility had learned how to stay close. But weight alone is not enough to shape worlds. What gathers must eventually transform. What holds must eventually glow. And somewhere within this newly anchored system, fire waited. Not as destruction, but as the next memory to be learned. Some truths are not lost, they are simply folded beneath silence, until warmth teaches them how to rise. Fire did not arrive as a spectacle, it arrived as restraint. At the centre of the young system, pressure and heat no longer argued. They held each other in place, neither winning, neither yielding. What burned there did not burn outward, it stayed. It learned how to remain without consuming everything that leaned toward it. This was not the violence of flame, but the discipline of balance. The sun was no longer only becoming, it was continuing. Inside its core, fusion repeated itself with quiet confidence. Hydrogen surrendered pieces of itself, merging, releasing energy that had nowhere to rush. Photons began a long, patient journey to flow outward, bouncing, scattering, forgetting their original direction. Light here was slow. It took thousands of years to escape a space smaller than the distance between worlds. Time once again learned patience. This fire did not roar. It hummed. The surrounding disk felt the change before it could be seen. Heat spread gently, like a memory returning to a room long left untouched. Materials shifted, not dramatically, but decisively. The boundary between what could endure warmth and what could not grew clearer. Ices retreated farther from the centre, carrying water and volatile compounds outward, preserving them in regions that would one day feel impossibly distant. Closer in, rock and metal remained. They did not complain. They remembered pressure too well. Fire began to organise the system, not by force, but by permission. It allowed certain distances to become safe. It discouraged others without ever forbidding them. The solar system learned spacing the way breath learns rhythm, through repetition, not instruction. The sun's light, still young and uneven, began to touch the disk's surface. Shadows formed for the first time. Dust grains cast brief darkness across one another. Tiny eclipses that lasted fractions of a moment yet marked a new condition, illumination. With light came contrast. With contrast came direction. Time now had texture. Solar wind followed, thin, persistent, unannounced. Charged particles streamed outward, brushing against gas that lingered too close. This wind did not tear. It persuaded. Lighter elements drifted away, gradually thinning the inner disk. What remained was what could resist departure. Fire, here, was selective. In the mid-regions of the disk, stones continued their quiet conversations. Collisions no longer felt random. Paths were shaped by gravity that had grown confident enough to guide. Larger bodies bent the space around them, encouraging smaller ones to follow, to gather, to belong. These bodies were still unfinished, still vulnerable, still forgetful, but they were learning something new. Heat could alter without erasing. Impacts melted surfaces briefly, allowing materials to blend, to differentiate, to sink or rise according to weight. Memory began to sort itself inside these growing forms. Heavy elements drifted inward. Lighter ones lingered near the surface. Differentiation began as a whisper, not a plan. The sun continued to breathe at the centre, its fire steady enough to be trusted. Around it, the system responded with slow obedience. Orbit stabilized. Resonances emerged. Motion learned repetition that could be relied upon. Fire, once feared as an ending, revealed itself as a teacher. It taught matter how to stay close without falling in. It taught distance how to matter. It taught time how to repeat without collapsing into sameness. The solar system was no longer only shaped by gravity, it was shaped by endurance. by the ability to exist under constant warmth without dissolving into it, by the discipline of remaining near fire without becoming fire. Somewhere in this measured heat, Earth's future grew more defined, not as a place but as a condition. A region where rock could persist, where water could someday return, where memory might one day settle long enough to be named. But nothing rushed toward that future. Fire was patient now, and patience, once learned, does not forget. The sun did not grow louder as it grew older. It grew steadier. Its fire settled into a rhythm that did not seek attention. Fusion continued without urgency. A quiet labour performed again and again, indifferent to witness. Light escaped slowly now, no longer trapped for ages within the core, but still reluctant, still softened by countless collisions before reaching open space. What emerged was not brilliance, but reliability. Reliability changes everything. Around this steady warmth, the disk learned how to listen. Temperatures stabilized into gradients that could be trusted, not exact, never exact, but consistent enough to allow repetition. Matter began to behave as though tomorrow might resemble today. This was new. Gas thinned in the inner regions, lifted away by solar wind and gentle radiation pressure. It did not vanish all at once. It loosened its grip slowly, like breath leaving a sleeping body. What remained behind was heavier, quieter, more willing to stay close to the plane of motion. The inner system grew sparse but deliberate, less crowded, more defined. Within this clearing, solid bodies continued their patient collisions. Pebbles met pebbles, stones met stones. Some encounters shattered years of accumulation in an instant. Others fused fragments into larger wholes that remembered their parts only as layers. Each collision rewrote history without commentary. Fire did not stop these impacts, it tempered them. Heat softened surfaces, allowed energy to dissipate through melting rather than fracture alone. Brief oceans of magma formed on growing bodies, glowing and then dimming as they radiated their excess into space. These molten moments were not chaos, they were sorting events. Heavy elements sank inward. Lighter materials rose. Memory rearranged itself by density rather than intention. The sun's warmth made this possible, not by force, by presence. Farther out beyond the inner disk, cold remained influential. Ice-rich bodies grew larger there, gathering mass quickly, swelling with materials that heat would not permit closer in. These distant worlds in progress learned a different lesson, that fire could be avoided without being escaped entirely. They orbited within reach of warmth, but never surrendered to it. The solar system began to show contrast, inner regions defined by endurance under heat, outer regions defined by preservation through distance. Between them lay gradients, transitions, quiet negotiations between fire and cold. Earth's future hovered within one of these negotiations. The sun did not choose this region. Gravity did not decree it. It emerged because balance allowed it. Light now filled the disk more evenly, scattering off dust, reflecting from stone. Shadows grew longer, more consistent. Time gained markers, rotation and revolution became clocks that did not need numbers. Motion itself measured duration. As bodies grew larger, their gravity began to matter beyond themselves. They nudged nearby paths, stole material, cleared lanes. The disk grew structured not by design, but by survival. Those that grew quickly altered the fates of those around them. Those that lagged behind were scattered, broken, forgotten. This was not cruelty, it was sorting. Fire watched without judgment. The sun's steady output continued to shape chemistry as well as motion. Volatile compounds that ventured too close were stripped, altered, driven outward. Others combined, transformed by heat into new arrangements that would persist even after cooling. Molecules learned resilience. Bonds formed that could survive warmth without unraveling. These changes were subtle, but they endured. Time stretched again. Thousands of years passed as gently as seconds once had. Nothing dramatic announced the passage. Only accumulation revealed it. Larger bodies, clearer orbits, fewer remnants of the original cloud. The solar system grew quieter as it matured. Noise belongs to beginnings, stability belongs to patience. Fire, now fully learned, no longer threatened the system's coherence. It anchored it. It provided a center that did not wander, a rhythm that did not falter. Around it, everything else learned how to move without forgetting where it belonged. Somewhere within this steady warmth, a particular body gathered enough mass to hold on to heat longer than others. Its interior remained molten between impacts. Its surface erased itself repeatedly, but its core began to remember. This body was not Earth yet, but it was learning how to become one. Fire had done its work, not by consuming, but by staying. And what stayed long enough to be shaped by it would one day carry its memory inward, beneath crust and ocean, beneath language itself. What remains close to fire learns discipline. What survives it learns form. And as the sun continued its quiet breathing, the system leaned forward, not toward brightness, but toward structure still unfinished, waiting to be named. Fire does not remember its first flame. It remembers how to last. By now, the sun had settled into a steadiness that no longer needed proof. Its light moved outward with calm certainty, filling space not with urgency, but with expectation. The system had learned to trust this warmth, not because it was gentle, but because it was consistent. Consistency allows matter to risk becoming something more than temporary. The inner disk thinned further, its gas long persuaded to drift away. What remained circled in quieter lanes, stones, metals, fragments that had endured enough heat to earn their place. These remnants no longer moved aimlessly. Their paths repeated, curved, intersected, and separated in rhythms that felt inevitable. Gravity had learned authorship. Larger bodies now shaped their surroundings without touching them. Their presence bent motion, encouraged accumulation, discouraged intrusion. Smaller fragments found themselves drawn in, captured, or cast aside depending on timing rather than merit. Chance, once dominant, had given way to influence. Fire continued to oversee this without interference. Within the growing bodies, heat lingered. Radioactive elements decayed slowly, releasing energy long after impacts had ceased to glow. These internal fires were quieter than the sun's, but more intimate. They warmed from within, allowing differentiation to continue even in the absence of collision. Cores grew dense, mantles softened, surfaces remained restless. These interiors learned to remember. Memory here was not recall. It was structure shaped by duration. The sun's light now reached every part of the disk that remained. Shadows sharpened, distances mattered. Regions that could hold on to volatiles without surrendering to cold learned how to keep them. Others lost them entirely. The solar system was no longer undecided about its character. Between the inner furnace and the outer cold, one region remained ambiguous. Warm enough to soften rock, cool enough to allow certain compounds to return. It was not protected, it was not chosen, it was simply allowed. Within this region, a growing body endured repeated impacts without being scattered. Its gravity grew strong enough to reclaim fragments rather than lose them. Each collision erased its surface again, but added mass beneath. Layers formed, melted, sank, rose, reformed. Fire reshaped it constantly, but did not unmake it. This persistence mattered more than size. Many bodies grew large only to be broken apart, scattered into belts and clouds that would never cohere again. Survival required not just mass, but timing, being present at the right distances, under the right conditions, long enough for chance to favour endurance. The sun did not favour this body. Fire did not bless it. It survived anyway. The disk thinned to a memory of its former self. What remained was no longer a cloud, but a system of paths, each body carrying its own small gravity, each orbit tracing a decision made long ago and rarely revisited. Silence returned in layers, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of processes that no longer needed to announce themselves. The solar system had learned its first long pause. Motion continued, but without uncertainty. Heat continued, but without threat. Fire had found its place, and in finding it, it allowed everything else to begin finding theirs, not as endings, but as continuations, as forms that could last long enough to be shaped by memory rather than erased by chance. The sun's steady glow now defined days that did not yet exist, seasons that had no surface to touch, rhythms that waited for worlds to arrive. Time itself seemed to lean inward, collecting patience from repetition. The body that would one day be called Earth was still unfinished, still molten, still unnamed. But it now held enough heat to resist forgetting itself between impacts. Its interior began to carry continuity, a memory deeper than surface. Fire, once feared as erasure, had become the condition for persistence. What survives fire learns shape. What endures warmth learns history, and as the sun continued to stay, breathing quietly at the centre of everything that remained, the system leaned toward its next transformation, one not of flame, but of stone learning how to gather without burning. But what the planet buried, it never truly forgot. Fire learned restraint by repeating itself, not through brilliance, not through expansion, but through the quiet discipline of returning to the same balance again and again. At the centre of the system, the sun continued its steady breathing, an ancient exchange between gravity and heat that did not need witnesses. Each fusion echoed the last, not as sameness, but as reliability. The system trusted this repetition. Trust allowed everything else to slow. Slowness deepened. Around the sun, what remained of the disk thinned into intention. Paths no longer wandered, orbits no longer argued. Motion had learned memory, where to curve, when to pass, how close was too close. Space itself seemed to remember where bodies belonged, guiding them without touch. This was not harmony. It was habit refined by endurance. Heat softened surfaces that had already learned how to hold together. Molten layers appeared and vanished, not as disasters, but as pauses, moments where form was allowed to reconsider itself. Heavy elements sank inward, drawn by patience rather than urgency. Lighter materials hovered, uncertain, sometimes escaping, sometimes returning. Nothing was final, but nothing was careless anymore. Fire did not erase, it edited. Inside growing bodies, warmth lingered long after impacts had quieted. Radioactive decay whispered from within, a secondary fire that did not illuminate but sustained. These internal breaths allowed differentiation to continue even in stillness. Memory layered itself into cores and mantles, into densities that would not easily be undone. Surfaces remained restless, interiors began to remember. The sun's influence stretched outward without insisting. It set boundaries by existing, by staying where it was and refusing to wander. Distance became meaningful, nearness carried consequence. Farther away, cold still preserved ancient compounds, keeping them intact for futures that would arrive much later. Between these extremes, a region persisted in ambiguity, neither spared by distance nor consumed by warmth. Here, stone endured without becoming vapor. Here, compounds could be lost and regained. Here, repetition did not erase everything it touched. Fire allowed this middle to exist. Within it, one body continued to gather itself despite constant interruption. Its surface was rewritten endlessly, but its mass accumulated quietly beneath. Gravity strengthened not as dominance, but as confidence, the assurance that fragments could return after being scattered. Impacts came slower now, fewer, heavier. Each one changed less than the last. Time thickened again. The solar system grew quiet in a way that did not suggest emptiness, but readiness. What remained was no longer testing whether it could stay. It had stayed long enough to prove it could. The noise of formation faded into the background, leaving behind processes that moved without announcement. Fire no longer defined the moment. It defined the condition. Light continued to travel outward, touching stones that had once been dust, warming bodies that would one day cool enough to remember water, air, and sky. The sun did not demand attention. It offered consistency, and consistency over long durations shapes more than force ever could. The inner regions cleared further. What could not endure proximity drifted away, carrying unused possibility into silence. What remained leaned into stability, circling with a confidence earned through survival rather than speed. Fire watched this sorting without preference. The system had learned something irreversible, that endurance was more valuable than brilliance, that remaining was harder than appearing, that shape came not from sudden events but from long obedience to balance. The sun continued to stay, and because it stayed, stones were allowed to gather without burning. Because it stayed, warmth could be trusted not to undo everything it touched. Because it stayed, time could layer itself into matter without being constantly reset. This was the quiet victory of fire, not that it shone, but that it restrained itself long enough for memory to settle. What followed would not be flame, it would be weight learning how to gather, stone learning how to forget its stellar past. But those lessons waited. For now, the system rested inside its first sustained calm, holding warmth without fear, holding motion without normal noise. Fire had learned its place, and in doing so it made room for everything that would come next. Some truths are not forged in heat. They are cooled into being. Stone begins as apology, not for what it is, but for what it no longer remembers how to be. Long before surfaces hardened enough to keep their shape, long before gravity learned which fragments to forgive and which to scatter, every stone in the system had already lived another life, not as rock, not as body, but as light, as heat, as pressure inside stars that burned until they could no longer hold themselves together. Stone is what remains when fire finishes speaking. The solar system carried this inheritance quietly. Around the steady sun, fragments drifted, dense, silent, newly reluctant to change. They moved along paths learned through repetition, circling without question, colliding without anger. Each impact was not a battle, but a forgetting. With every collision, stellar memory thinned. Heat dissipated. Light was lost. What remained grew heavier, slower, more willing to stay where it landed. This was not decay, it was translation. Dust grains met and clung not because they wanted to, but because separation required more effort than remaining together. Electrostatic whispers helped at first, brief attractions that faded as quickly as they formed. But gravity waited beneath these early bonds, patient and strengthening. Each successful union made the next more likely. Pebbles emerged, then stones. These stones did not glow, they did not burn. They absorbed energy and released it slowly, like breaths taken long after urgency had passed. They learned how to be cool in a system shaped by warmth. They learned how to endure without reacting. Paths grew crowded in some regions, empty in others. Motion sorted matter without intention. Where collisions were frequent, growth accelerated. Where space was sparse, fragments wandered longer, sometimes forever. Chance still mattered, but chance now operated within boundaries set by mass and distance. The disk, once a cloud, now felt like a field of decisions already made. Stones collided and shattered, their pieces remembering the encounter only as altered shape. Others collided and merged, layers folding into layers, histories compressed into density. Each resulting body carried within it the record of everything it had survived, not as memory, but as structure. This structure mattered. Heavier elements sank inward during moments of heat, whether from impact or lingering warmth. Lighter materials lingered near the surface, waiting to be stripped away or locked in place. Differentiation began not as plan, but as consequence. Interiors grew distinct from exteriors. Inside and outside learned they were not the same. Stone learned depth. The sun watched this without interference. Its fire had already done what it needed to do. Now it allowed distance to work. Gravity spoke more often than heat. Weight became persuasive. Bodies that reached a certain size no longer lost fragments easily. What struck them stayed. What broke away often returned. These bodies grew not because they were favoured, but because they were present when accumulation mattered. Earth's future hid among these processes, indistinguishable from countless others. There was nothing special about it yet. No signature, no promise, just mass learning how to resist being erased. The solar system grew quieter as stone took over the conversation. Light still filled space, but it no longer rearranged everything it touched. Fire had stepped back. In its place, patience ruled. Stone is patient. It does not hurry up toward form. It accepts it slowly. And as fragments continued their silent negotiations, colliding, merging, breaking, returning, the system leaned deeper into solidity. What once flowed now resisted. What once scattered now gathered. Stellar ancestry faded with every cooling surface. Stars had given these materials their beginning. But stone was teaching them how to stay. Stone forgets slowly. It does not release its past all at once. It sheds it in layers, like warmth leaving a surface after sunset. Deep inside each growing body, the memory of fire lingered, not as flame but as rearranged matter, as density that refused to return to dust. These stones were cooling, but they were not finished becoming. Around the sun, motion settled into repetition so familiar it felt inevitable. Orbits traced the same curves again and again, not because they were perfect, but because nothing disturbed them enough to demand change. In this steadiness, collisions became more deliberate. Not fewer, just slower, heavier, more consequential. When stones met now, they did not always shatter. Often they merged. Their surfaces softened briefly, not glowing, not violent, just warm enough to allow edges to blur. Fractures healed into seams, seams folded into layers. What had been separate forgot how to be apart. Weight learned continuity. Inside these bodies, heat retreated inward. Surfaces cooled first, forming fragile skins that cracked under later impacts, then reformed again. Each cooling left behind a slightly thicker crust, a little more resistant to forgetting. Beneath it, interiors remained pliable, responsive, alive with slow movement that did not announce itself. Stone began to circulate itself. Heavier materials drifted downward, responding to gravity that had grown confident enough to reorganize interiors. Iron and nickel sank, gathering towards centers that did not yet know they were cores. Lighter silicates lingered above, forming mantles that remembered heat longer. This separation was not planned. It happened because time allowed it to. Time is the only architect stone obeys. The sun's warmth continued to reach these bodies, but it no longer rearranged them completely. It touched surfaces, warmed days that did not yet exist, then withdrew. Stone learned resilience, the ability to be warmed without being undone. Farther out, bodies rich with ice grew large quickly, swelling with materials the inner regions had lost. These worlds learned a different kind of forgetting, not of fire, but of warmth itself. Their interiors remained cold, their surfaces preserved ancient compounds unchanged for eons. They carried memory by keeping it intact rather than transforming it. Closer in, stone learned memory by letting go. Between these regions, fragments crossed paths endlessly. Some were captured, some were scattered into belts and clouds, reminders of bodies that almost became more than debris. These remnants were not failures, they were pauses, stories interrupted before they could gather enough weight to continue. The solar system did not erase them, it set them aside. Stone growth was uneven. Some bodies surged ahead, their gravity increasing quickly enough to alter nearby paths. Others lagged, colliding too often, losing mass as fast as they gained it. Survival was not about speed alone, it was about timing, location, and endurance under repetition. One body, neither largest nor smallest, continued to hold on to what it gathered. Its gravity was modest but sufficient. Its position allowed it to receive fragments without being stripped of them. Impacts rewrote its surface repeatedly, but each rewrite added more than it removed. This persistence mattered more than brilliance. Inside this body, differentiation deepened. A core thickened, drawing heavy elements inward like a long-held breath finally released. Above it, layers shifted slowly, convecting heat upward, carrying memory toward the surface only to cool again. These movements were silent, but they shaped the future more than any collision. Stone was learning interior life. The sun continued its quiet supervision, unchanged, unbothered. Fire no longer defined what was possible. Distance and mass did. The system had matured enough to allow stone to speak in its own language. That language was slow. Every orbit repeated a lesson. Every impact tested endurance. Every cooling surface asked whether this shape could last. Most could not, but some did, and those that did began to carry something new, not awareness, not intention, but continuity that extended beyond surface events. Stone forgot its stellar origin not because it was erased, but because it was buried beneath newer arrangements. Light became isotope, heat became density, memory became structure. Stars had taught matter how to exist. Stone was teaching it how to persist. And as bodies continued to grow and cool, circling a sun that had learned restraint, the solar system leaned toward a quieter phase, one where the violence of gathering gave way to the patience of holding. But stone does not finish learning all at once. It must endure silence long enough for weight to become identity. Stone learns identity by surviving itself. As time stretched and collisions grew rarer, the solar system slipped into a quieter labour. The frantic negotiations of early gathering softened into long intervals of circling, waiting, holding. What had grown large enough to keep its fragments now faced a different test, not whether it could form, but whether it could remain recognizable through change. Silence deepened between impacts. Within growing bodies, interiors stayed warm long after surfaces cooled. Heat moved slowly now, not in flashes, but in currents that took thousands of years to complete a single cycle. Stone flowed without appearing to move. Layers shifted, rose, sank, and folded, carrying the memory of earlier heat upward and then letting it fade again. This motion did not seek expression, it sought balance. The sun's presence continued to matter, but quietly. Its light touched surfaces, warmed days that did not yet exist, then passed on. Stone accepted this warmth without reacting. It no longer mistook heat for command, it had learned restraint from fire and patience from time. Around these bodies, space grew cleaner. Debris that once crowded every path was either absorbed, scattered outward, or locked into belts that would linger as echoes of unfinished stories. Each clearing left behind wider distances, calmer orbits, fewer interruptions. Motion began to feel deliberate even when it was not. Time accumulated weight. On some bodies, impact still came hard enough to melt entire surfaces. These events erased everything briefly, then allowed it to reform. Oceans of molten stone spread, cooled, cracked, and sealed again. Each cycle pushed heavier elements deeper, refining interiors further. With every reset, the body became harder to fully undo. Stone learned resilience through repetition. Other bodies experienced gentler histories. Fewer impacts, slower accumulation. Their surfaces cooled and stayed cool, preserving earlier arrangements almost unchanged. They carried memory by stillness rather than transformation. The solar system allowed both kinds of remembering to exist side by side. Difference did not require conflict. Between inner and outer regions, gradients sharpened. Warmth faded into cold not abruptly but patiently, like dusk settling across a surface too vast to notice at once. In these transitional zones, materials learned flexibility. Compounds formed, broke, reformed under shifting conditions. Nothing here stayed fixed long enough to forget change entirely. Earth's future remained hidden within one such region, not distinguished by brilliance or mass, but by endurance under contradiction. It was warmed, then cooled, struck, then allowed to recover, stripped of some materials, then gifted others. Each event altered it without erasing continuity. Continuity mattered more than perfection. Inside this body, the core grew denser, heavier, more confident in its place. It anchored the layers above, giving them something to move around rather than away from. Mantles convected slowly, redistributing heat with quiet persistence. Surfaces cracked and healed. Memory layered itself into depth rather than appearance. Stone was becoming layered time. The sun did not notice this individually. It did not need to. Its role had shifted from sculptor to witness. Fire had done its work. Now gravity and duration carried the story forward. Across the system, bodies settled into their long-term paths. Resonances emerged, subtle harmonies between orbits that discouraged chaos. Some paths became crowded, others emptied. Motion learned preference not by decision but by survival. The system breathed in stability. Fragments that could not find a place drifted into obscurity, cast outward to distant reservoirs, or locked into belts that would persist as quiet reminders of near beginnings. These remnants were not errors. They were pauses that never resumed. Stone does not mourn them. It keeps moving. As surfaces cooled further, new kinds of stillness appeared. Crusts thickened. Interiors remained warm but contained. Energy escaped more slowly now, radiated into space over immense durations. Bodies began to resemble surfaces rather than processes. This resemblance was fragile, but it mattered. Stone had now forgotten how to be light. Not completely, not at the atomic level, but enough to accept its new role. It was no longer fuel, it was foundation. It carried memory by resisting change rather than embracing it. Stars had taught matter how to burn, stone was teaching it how to wait, and waiting reshaped the system more thoroughly than any early violence had. The solar system leaned into maturity not by finishing, but by slowing, by allowing long intervals where nothing dramatic happened and everything essential continued. Stone did not yet know water, it did not yet know air, it did not yet know sky, but it was learning how to hold them, and as orbits repeated and interiors turned silently beneath cooling crusts, the story bent gently toward its next quiet transformation, one where silence itself would begin to settle into shape. Stone does not announce when it becomes something else. It simply stops returning to what it was. As the solar system continued its long exhale, change arrived less often, but carried more weight when it did. The intervals between impacts stretched wider, like pauses inserted deliberately into the story. Silence became the dominant condition, not empty, not inactive, but full of slow processes unfolding beneath surfaces that appeared still. Stone accepted this silence. Crusts thickened on bodies that had endured enough heat to organize their interiors. Once fragile skins grew more resistant to forgetting. Cracks still formed, but they did not reach as deep. The surface could break without the whole being undone. This separation between appearance and essence mattered. It allowed continuity to survive disruption. Inside, movement continued. Mantles convected slowly, redistributing warmth through cycles too long to be witnessed. Heat rose, cooled, sank again, carrying with it the memory of earlier fire without reawakening it. These motions did not seek release. They sought balance. Stone was learning equilibrium not as stillness, but as contained motion. The sun's influence now felt distant, even to bodies that orbited close. Its warmth touched surfaces gently, briefly, no longer capable of rearranging interiors wholesale. Fire had receded into background rhythm. What remained was duration, the long, quiet insistence of time passing without event. Time pressed inward rather than forward. Across the system, the clearing continued. Small fragments that once crowded every path had mostly been claimed, scattered, or set aside. Orbits widened. Encounters grew rare. The violence of formation faded into memory that no surface could fully recall, but no interior could entirely forget. Stone grew confident in its weight. Bodies that had reached sufficient mass now shaped their surroundings subtly. They shepherded fragments, nudged paths, discouraged chaos through presence alone. Their gravity was no longer tentative. It carried authority earned through endurance rather than force. Earth's future remained among these bodies, not dominant, not exceptional, but persistent. Its history was neither the quietest nor the most violent. It was varied enough to avoid stagnation and gentle enough to avoid erasure. Each survival added another layer of continuity beneath its changing surface. Inside this body, the core stabilized further, dense and heavy, anchoring everything above it. Around it, layers moved with patient inevitability. Above them, crusts cooled and cracked, reformed and cooled again. Each cycle thickened the record of endurance. Stone was becoming archive, not of events, but of pressures endured, not of moments, but of balances held. The solar system now carried memory in its structure rather than its motion. Orbits repeated so faithfully they felt eternal. Distances stabilized. Resonances held. What would change from now on would change slowly, reluctantly, and rarely without consequence. Fragments that had not found homes lingered in belts and distant reservoirs, drifting in quiet obedience to gravity they barely felt. They carried ancient memory untouched by later processes, preserving conditions that no longer existed closer in. These were not leftovers. They were witnesses set aside. Stone did not need them to move forward, but it allowed them to remain. As surfaces cooled further, new kinds of stillness appeared. Not emptiness, but readiness. Bodies now resembled places rather than processes. They could hold on to shapes long enough for new stories to arrive. They could preserve conditions long enough for accumulation to mean something beyond mass. Stone had forgotten how to be star stuff in motion. It had learned how to be ground. This forgetting was not loss. It was translation completed. Light had become isotope, heat had become structure, pressure had become form. What once burned now waited. The sun continued its quiet breathing, unchanged, untroubled. It did not guide this forgetting, it allowed it. Fire had stepped aside, trusting stone to carry the story forward without assistance. The solar system rested inside this new calm, not finished, not settled, but slowed enough to allow depth to matter. Nothing hurried. Nothing needed to. Stone had learned its role, and in learning it, the system prepared for a future that required patience above all else. A future where surfaces would one day be tested by water, by air, by cycles that did not yet exist. But for now, stone waited, holding weight, holding silence. What once shone had learned to remain dim. What once burned had learned to hold shape. And beneath cooling crusts, beneath repeating orbits, beneath a sun that had learned to stay, the next quiet transformation waited, folded beneath time, unannounced. Stone becomes complete not when it stops changing, but when change stops erasing it. By now, the solar system had entered a long, deliberate quiet. Not a pause, but a condition. Motion continued everywhere, yet nothing felt urgent. Orbits repeated with such faithfulness that they seemed to remember themselves. Bodies turned through space as if they had always known where they belonged, even though belonging had been learned slowly, through survival rather than certainty. Stone accepted this quiet as its element. Surfaces cooled into permanence that was never absolute. Crusts cracked, shifted, healed. But beneath them, interiors held steady, warm enough to move, cool enough to remember. Heat no longer sought escape. It circulated, lingered, softened without destroying. Stone had learned how to contain what once would have undone it. The sun remained present but distant in influence. Its light traced paths across surfaces, marking days that had no observers, warming ground that had not yet learned how to hold water. Fire was no longer a sculptor. It was a background rhythm, steady and trusted, allowing stone to speak in slower language. Across the system, bodies now carried distinct identities, not as names, not as awareness, but as histories embedded in density and depth. Each one bore the record of what it had endured, how often it had been struck, how deeply it had melted, how slowly it had cooled. These records were not readable yet, but they existed. Stone had become memory made solid. Fragments still drifted, but fewer now. Those that remained unclaimed settled into long paths, tracing loops that would last longer than anything that had formed them. Belts and distant clouds held remnants of earlier chaos, preserved not out of sentiment, but because nothing disturbed them enough to demand change. Silence protected them. Closer in, bodies stood firm enough to resist forgetting. Their gravity no longer asked permission to keep what touched them. Impacts came rarely, but when they did, they altered surfaces rather than identities. Continuity survived interruption. Earth's future had crossed a threshold here. Not of size, not of brilliance, but of persistence. It could be struck and remain itself, melted and reformed without losing its interior story, stripped of some materials and replenished by others. It had learned how to change without starting over. This learning mattered more than growth. Inside, layers continued their slow conversations. Heat rose, cooled, sank again. Material differentiated further, responding to gravity's quiet insistence. Cores anchored, mantles flowed, crusts thickened. These motions were patient enough to last for ages without resolution. Stone was not seeking an ending. It was learning duration. Time folded inward again. The solar system no longer resembled a beginning. It resembled a setting, one where surfaces could exist long enough to be shaped by forces gentler than collision. One where silence could accumulate meaning rather than erase it. One where waiting itself became a kind of action. Stone had fully forgotten how to be light. Not because light was gone, but because it was no longer needed. The memory of stars remained buried deep within atoms, locked into isotopes and bonds that no longer glowed. That memory would resurface one day in other forms, heat from decay, magnetism, subtle forces rising from cores, but for now it slept. What mattered was weight, and weight had learned how to stay. The sun continued its steady breathing, unchanged, unconcerned. Around it, stone carried the story forward without asking for guidance. Fire had taught restraint. Gravity had taught patience. Time had taught memory. The violence of becoming had softened into the discipline of being. This chapter of the system did not end. It settled. Stone had finished forgetting its stellar past. It had learned how to hold shape long enough for something else to arrive. Something quieter, something slower, something that would need ground before it could ever learn to move. But that arrival waited. For now, the solar system rested in stone and silence. Its earliest chaos folded beneath layers of endurance, its future unspoken, but no longer impossible. What gathered could now hold. What held could now wait. And waiting, as the planet would one day learn, is how entirely new stories begin. Silence arrived without announcement. It did not fall, it did not replace anything. It simply became noticeable once there was less noise to compete with it. The solar system, now shaped enough to recognize itself, settled into a quieter form of motion. Bodies continued to move endlessly, faithfully, but the urgency that once drove their paths had thinned. What remained was repetition without drama, circling that did not seek change, turning that did not require attention. Between the orbits, space widened. This space was not empty. It was deliberate. Distance had become a tool rather than a gap, a way of keeping stories from colliding too often. Gravity no longer pulled indiscriminately, it guided gently, discouraging chaos not by force but by habit learned over long durations. Silence lived here. It lived in the dark arcs between worlds, where nothing touched and nothing needed to. It lived in the time it took light to cross distances that no longer collapsed inward. It lived in the waiting, the kind of waiting that does not expect interruption. Orbits repeated themselves so precisely that they felt eternal, though nothing here was. Each body traced the same curve through space, again and again, like a sentence rewritten until it no longer needed emphasis. Motion became background. Silence became foreground. This silence did not erase memory. It preserved it. Without constant collision, surfaces could cool into forms that lasted. Without endless disruption, interiors could continue their slow rearrangements uninterrupted. Silence allowed duration to matter more than moment. It gave time permission to deepen. The sun remained at the center, steady and indifferent. Its light passed through space without hurry, touching bodies briefly, then moving on. It no longer rearranged paths, it illuminated them. Fire had fully stepped back into rhythm. Between the inner worlds and the outer distances, gaps widened into regions of calm. These spaces were not mistakes, they were buffers, zones where motion could breathe without consequence. The system had learned that not everything must be filled. Jupiter's presence began to matter here, not through touch but through influence. Its growing mass bent paths long before bodies came near it. It shaped the silence by deciding which routes would remain stable and which would slowly unravel. Gravity authored futures without ever appearing in them. Some paths grew crowded, others emptied. Fragments that wandered into unstable regions were redirected, scattered outward, or pulled inward depending on timing rather than intention. The silence between orbits became selective, not welcoming, not hostile, simply consistent. What fit endured, what did not drifted away. This quiet sorting changed everything. Earth's future circled within a corridor of relative calm, not protected, not favoured, but allowed. Its orbit did not cross too many others. Its path avoided the strongest disturbances. It repeated long enough to let internal processes continue without constant interruption. Repetition is how memory thickens. Between each pass around the sun, time gathered. Heat escaped slowly. Interiors convected without haste. Surfaces cooled into patterns that could survive the next turn. Silence gave these changes room to accumulate rather than reset. Elsewhere, bodies trapped in noisier regions never found this calm. Their paths intersected too often. Their surfaces never cooled enough to keep shape. They remained processes rather than places. Many would be broken apart, scattered into belts that would never fully assemble again. The solar system accepted this without judgment. Silence does not reward. It simply remains. As orbits stabilized further, resonances emerged, subtle harmonies between periods of motion that discouraged chaos. These resonances did not lock bodies into perfection. They nudged them away from disaster, allowing small deviations without collapse. Stability became flexible rather than rigid. Flexibility lasts longer. The dark spaces between paths grew meaningful. They became the margins where nothing happened quickly, where motion could continue without consequence. These spaces were as important as the bodies themselves. Without them, everything would still collide. Without them, memory would still be erased. Silence was the final architect of form. It did not build, it allowed building to remain. As the system turned through this quieter phase, its early violence folded deeper into the past, preserved only in scars and densities that no longer announced themselves. What remained visible was calm, not static, not finished, but sustained. The solar system had learned how to rest while moving, and in that rest, something subtle prepared to change. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly enough to be missed by anything impatient. Silence does not announce what it is preparing. It simply holds space for it. Silence is not the absence of motion. It is the absence of collision. As the solar system continued its slow turning, the spaces between paths grew more articulate. They learned how wide they needed to be. Not too wide, nothing here was wasted, but wide enough to let repetition deepen into habit. Bodies passed one another without meeting. Nearness became a concept measured in gravitational influence rather than touch. This distance mattered. It allowed orbits to become sentences that could be read the same way each time. It allowed surfaces to cool without being immediately rewritten. It allowed interiors to keep secrets long enough to matter. Silence was not passive, it was protective. The sun's light travelled through these gaps like breath through a ribcage. Unnoticed, constant, essential. It warmed without rearranging. It illuminated without demanding response. Fire had learned not to interfere with silence. It respected the space it had helped create. Farther out, the giants shaped quiet by bending it. Their mass curved paths long before contact, steering fragments away from fragile inner regions or flinging them outward into long, lonely arcs. These interventions were not events. They were tendencies. Futures nudged rather than forced. Gravity edited without noise. In these edits, entire histories were decided. A fragment that passed one way would linger. Another, passing slightly closer, would be redirected forever. Thing announced these moments, no witness marked them, yet they determined which regions would remain calm and which would never settle. Earth's future continued its circling through one of the calmer lanes, its orbit neither crowded nor empty. It experienced disturbance, but not constantly. Enough to be shaped, not enough to be erased. Silence gave it intervals, long stretches where nothing struck, where cooling could proceed, where internal motion could continue uninterrupted. Intervals are where depth forms. Within these pauses, the planet in progress reorganized itself quietly. Heat rose and fell. Materials separated further. Magnetic stirrings began deep within, unannounced and unseen. None of this required impact. It required time without interruption. Silence provided that time. Elsewhere, bodies without such intervals remained shallow. Their interiors never fully organized. Their surfaces never stayed long enough to remember. They existed in motion without accumulation. Their stories reset again and again until nothing remained but debris. Silence chose without intention. Resonances continued to weave through the system, gentle synchronizations between orbits that discouraged instability. These rhythms were not precise enough to be brittle. They flexed, adapted, allowed minor changes without collapse. Stability learned how to bend. Bending lasts longer than rigidity. The dark spaces between paths now carried history. They remembered where collisions used to be frequent and where they had ceased. They remembered the thinning of debris, the widening of lanes. Silence, like sediment, accumulated. Time felt thicker here, not because more happened, but because what happened stayed. Each orbit added another layer of continuity. Each year without collision deepened memory rather than erasing it. The system's early violence receded further, not lost, but buried beneath habit. The sun continued to witness without intervening. Its role was no longer to shape paths, but to mark them, to provide a steady reference that allowed repetition to be recognized. Days and years existed now in principle, even without surfaces to measure them. Silence made measurement possible. Between inner worlds and distant cold, the system breathed in equilibrium, not perfect, never perfect, but resilient enough to endure variation without unraveling. This resilience was quiet. It did not celebrate itself. It simply persisted. Fragments that wandered into silence either adapted or departed. Those that could not find stable paths were redirected into distant reservoirs, carrying ancient conditions untouched by later calm. These distant stores became memory vaults, places where the system set aside what it no longer needed nearby but refused to destroy. Silence is generous that way. It allows forgetting without erasure. As the solar system turned through this phase, the idea of catastrophe faded from daily relevance. Change slowed. Consequence stretched across longer spans. What altered now did so gradually, often invisibly. The system had matured into a state where endurance mattered more than reaction. Earth's future benefited from this maturity without knowing it. Its orbit repeated. Its interior continued to organize. Its surface cooled into a crust that could crack and heal without vanishing entirely. Silence allowed it to become a place rather than a process. A place is simply a process that lasts. Between the orbits, darkness held everything together, not as void but as interval, as the space where nothing needed to happen quickly, as the condition that allowed memory to stop being overwritten. Silence did not finish the solar system. It made it possible to continue, and as this quiet deepened, As distances stabilized and motion repeated without interruption, the system leaned toward another subtle shift, one not driven by impact or heat, but by accumulation of absence. For what is not disturbed long enough begins to change in ways that cannot be rushed. But that change, like silence itself, did not announce its arrival. Silence changes what it surrounds, not quickly, not visibly, but with a patience that cannot be argued with. As the solar system continued its long turning, the quiet between paths began to feel less like space and more like structure. Distance was no longer an absence waiting to be filled. It was a boundary that held meaning. Each orbit respected the next, not because it had to, but because nothing pressed it otherwise. Motion learned restraint by repetition. Bodies passed one another endlessly without contact, their gravitational conversations subtle and sustained. A slight tug here, a gentle release there. Influence replaced collision as the dominant language. The system had matured enough to speak softly and still be understood. In this softness, time behaved differently. Years passed without visible change. Centuries added nothing dramatic. Even thousands of turns around the sun left surfaces largely intact. This was not stagnation. It was depth forming quietly beneath stability. Silence allowed small processes to accumulate rather than be interrupted. Inside worlds, this mattered profoundly. Heat continued to move through interiors, not urgently but faithfully. Convection traced slow loops through mantles, carrying energy upward, releasing it then sinking again. These cycles were too slow to witness, but too persistent to ignore. Silence gave them uninterrupted time to shape structure from within. Stone remembered through stillness. Without constant impacts, crusts thickened unevenly, responding to interior motion rather than external force. Faults formed, shifted, rested. The surface learned flexibility. It could crack without breaking itself apart. It could hold scars without reopening them endlessly. This endurance was born of quiet. Elsewhere, where silence was less complete, bodies struggled to reach this state. Their paths crossed too often. Their surfaces never cooled enough to stay. They remained vulnerable to erasure, unable to accumulate depth before the next disruption arrived. The difference was not size. It was interval. Interval determines destiny. The sun's light continued to pass through the system without insistence. It marked time without accelerating it. Shadows moved predictably across surfaces that no one observed. Days and nights existed in principle, waiting for something that could notice them. Between the inner calm and the outer cold, gravity maintained its quiet authorship. Massive bodies shaped regions of silence by bending space around them, creating zones of stability and instability without ever announcing where the boundaries lay. A fragment might drift peacefully for ages, only to find itself slowly guided away. Redirected by influence, it never felt directly. These decisions were final, but they were not sudden. Silence made consequence subtle. Earth's future continued its patient circling, protected not by favour, but by balance. Its orbit remained clear enough to avoid constant interruption, yet close enough to the sun to retain internal warmth. This balance was fragile, but it held. Turn after turn, age after age. Within this continuity, identity deepened. The planet in progress was no longer merely accumulating mass. It was accumulating history that could not be easily undone. Each quiet interval added another layer of memory beneath the surface, another cycle completed, another rearrangement finished without being erased. Silence allowed memory to sink inward. Across the system, debris thinned further. What remained unclaimed settled into distant paths, tracing long arcs that would last longer than the processes that placed them there. These fragments did not intrude on inner calm. They orbited far away, preserving early conditions in cold darkness. The solar system did not forget them. It simply moved on without them. Silence is selective in that way. It does not keep everything. It keeps what fits. As orbits repeated and distances held, the system's early chaos faded into a condition that felt permanent, though it was not. This permanence was an illusion created by duration, a sense that nothing would change because nothing had changed recently. But silence does not stop change, it slows it. What followed this long quiet would not arrive as impact or fire. It would arrive as accumulation, of gases held instead of stripped, of compounds preserved instead of scattered, of conditions allowed to persist long enough to matter. Silence was preparing space, not for motion, not for heat, but for retention. And as the solar system rested within this deepening calm, as orbits continued their faithful tracing and interiors turned unseen beneath cooling crusts, the next transformation waited quietly, folded into the intervals, patient as everything else that lasts. Some changes begin not when something arrives, but when nothing interrupts. Silence teaches matter how to keep what it is given, not by force, by absence. As the solar system continued its slow turning, the quiet between paths deepened into something almost tangible. Distances no longer felt provisional. They felt earned. Each orbit carried the memory of thousands before it, reinforcing a pattern that no longer needed correction. Motion persisted, but it no longer searched for outcome. In this quiet, gravity softened its voice. It still shaped everything, but without urgency. Bodies influenced one another through long, gentle pulls that accumulated over ages rather than moments. A slight tilt corrected here, a subtle elongation smoothed there. Change happened so slowly it felt like stillness from within. Stillness is simply change that respects time. The sun's light continued its patient crossing, warming surfaces just enough to matter, never enough to disrupt. Fire had become a background presence, felt, relied upon, rarely noticed. Its steadiness allowed the system to forget its early volatility without erasing its effects. Silence worked inward. Inside worlds that had earned long intervals without interruption, interiors reorganized more thoroughly. Heat rose and fell in measured cycles. Chemical boundaries sharpened. Materials settled into layers that resisted mixing. This was not stagnation. It was refinement through patience. Surfaces responded quietly. Crusts thickened where interiors cooled enough to support them. Elsewhere, thinner air regions flexed and shifted, releasing pressure without breaking continuity. These adjustments were not dramatic. They did not announce themselves. They simply happened, repeatedly, until shape became habit. Silence allowed surfaces to learn memory. In regions where calm was incomplete, this learning never finished. Bodies continued to be struck, stirred, reset. Their interiors remained shallow, their surfaces temporary. The difference was not their composition, it was their exposure to interruption. The solar system did not protect anyone from this. It allowed conditions to decide. Earth's future remained within a corridor where silence was frequent enough to matter. Not uninterrupted, never uninterrupted, but generous in its intervals, long enough for cooling to progress, long enough for internal motion to complete cycles, long enough for continuity to become identity. Identity does not appear, it accumulates. Between orbits the darkness thickened, not as absence but as space where nothing demanded attention. This darkness held paths apart, preventing interactions that would have undone everything achieved so far. It was the negative space that allowed form to persist. Silence was the final stabilizer. As time passed without incident, the system began to resemble something finished, not because it was, but because change had slowed below the threshold of notice. This illusion of permanence settled gently, encouraging further persistence. But silence never promises forever. It only offers time. In distant regions, slow disturbances still brewed. Massive bodies adjusted paths over immense durations, resonances shifted subtly. Distant fragments were nudged inward or outward along trajectories that would take millions of years to complete. Nothing here was static, it was simply patient. Silence hid motion by stretching it thin. Earth's future benefited from this hidden motion. Its orbit remained clear. Its interior continued to release heat gradually rather than catastrophically. Its surface cooled into crust capable of holding shape long enough for new processes to arrive. Those processes waited. For now, the system rested in a state where retention was possible, where gases could linger, where compounds could remain near surfaces instead of being stripped away immediately. Silence created the conditions for holding rather than losing. What came next would depend on this holding, not on impact, not on fire, but on what silence allowed to remain. As orbits continued their faithful tracing and distances held firm, the solar system leaned toward another subtle threshold, one defined not by motion or heat, but by atmosphere waiting for permission to stay. But that permission would arrive quietly, Like everything else that matters here, silence never announces its gifts. It simply leaves them behind. Silence completes its work by staying longer than anything expects. By now, the solar system had entered a depth of calm that could only be reached after chaos had exhausted itself. Motion remained, but it had learned humility. Every orbit traced a path so familiar it felt etched into space itself. Distance no longer asked permission to exist. It held its place with quiet confidence. Silence had become infrastructure. Between the worlds, darkness stretched without tension. It did not pull bodies together or push them apart. It simply allowed them to pass again and again without interference. This allowance shaped the system more thoroughly than any early collision ever had. Time grew heavy here. Not heavy with events, but heavy with continuity. Each revolution added another layer of sameness, not monotonous, but stabilizing. Patterns repeated long enough to feel dependable. Dependability is what allows fragile things to remain. Inside worlds that had earned this calm, change moved inward. Heat escaped gradually, threading its way from core to surface through cycles that took ages to complete. Interiors refined themselves further, smoothing boundaries, redistributing material with quiet insistence. Nothing rushed toward equilibrium. Equilibrium arrived slowly, shaped by restraint. Surfaces thickened into places. Crusts no longer formed and vanished endlessly. They cracked, shifted, healed, and remained. Faults became features rather than failures. Scars stopped reopening every time they were touched. Silence allowed surfaces to age instead of resetting. Aging is memory held in place. The sun continued to mark time without disturbing it. Its light defined repetition, day following day, year following year, long before anything could notice. Fire had become a clock rather than a sculptor. Its role was no longer to change matter, but to allow change to be measured. Between the inner calm and the outer cold, the system balanced itself without instruction. Massive bodies continued their slow gravitational conversations, adjusting paths so gently that the results would only be felt far in the future. Influence replaced impact entirely. Silence allowed cause and effect to separate in time. Earth's future remained within one of the system's quieter corridors, its path stable enough to preserve continuity, flexible enough to endure occasional disturbance. This balance mattered more now than mass or composition. Without silence, nothing it carried could have stayed. Within this corridor, something new became possible. Retention. Gases that once would have been stripped away too quickly now lingered longer near surfaces. Compounds that once scattered into space remained bound by gravity, patient enough to keep them. Silence did not create these materials. It allowed them to remain long enough to matter. This allowance was subtle, but it was decisive. The solar system had learned how to hold rather than lose, how to keep rather than scatter. Silence did not guarantee success. It only removed constant erasure. That was enough. Across the system, the last remnants of early violence drifted farther into memory. Belts and distant clouds carried unfinished stories outward, away from regions that needed calm to continue. The inner worlds were spared not by protection, but by distance earned through time. Silence protected nothing. It simply stayed. And by staying, it made persistence possible. The system now resembled something ready. Not complete, not finished, but capable of sustaining delicate processes that required long intervals without interruption. It could hold atmospheres. It could hold surfaces. It could hold conditions. What came next would not arrive as collision or fire. It would arrive as accumulation of breath, of pressure, of chemistry waiting long enough to remember itself. Silence had prepared the ground. Some transformations do not announce their beginning. They arrive quietly, carried by what was allowed to stay. And as the solar system continued its steady turning, wrapped in the dark spaces between its paths, it leaned toward its next memory, one written not in stone alone, but in air waiting to be kept. Earth did not begin as a place. It began as a condition, a gathering of weight that had not yet learned how to keep its own story intact. A body still deciding whether it could survive becoming itself. In the long calm that followed chaos, Earth existed not as land or sea or sky, but as persistence under pressure, an endurance that had not yet learned how to rest. It circled the sun faithfully now, its path held steady by silence earned over time, no longer scattered, no longer provisional, its orbit repeated often enough to feel inevitable. Yet inside that repetition, nothing was settled. Earth was still molten in places where memory could not yet stay. Its surface was rewritten again and again, each impact arriving less frequently but with weight enough to erase what had cooled before. Crust formed, cracked, melted, vanished. Not as failure of failure, as rehearsal. Each version tested how long it could last before being undone. Each version left something behind, heat rearranged, material sorted, depth gained. Earth learned by losing. Beneath the restless surface, interiors worked more quietly. Heat rose from the core in slow currents, carrying the legacy of formation upward, releasing it into layers that could not yet hold shape for long. Heavy elements remained anchored deep below, unwilling to return to motion. The core thickened, dense and insistent, learning how to stay even while everything above it changed. This core did not remember the surface, it did not need to. Memory here was not awareness, it was continuity. Earth's gravity strengthened subtly, not enough to dominate its neighbours, but enough to reclaim what struck it. Fragments that once would have scattered now returned, pulled back into the body they had briefly escaped. This mattered. Retention mattered. Without it, nothing could last long enough to become something else. The sun's warmth touched Earth repeatedly, marking cycles that no surface could yet record. Days and nights existed as rhythms without witnesses. Heat from above met heat from within, not in balance but in negotiation. Neither won, both persisted. Earth existed inside that negotiation. Atmosphere tried to form and failed. Gases released from the interior rose, lingered briefly, then escaped into space. Not because Earth rejected them, but because it could not yet keep them. Gravity was still learning confidence. Silence had made retention possible, but it had not made it certain. Nothing here was stable enough to be named. Water existed, but not as ocean. It arrived and departed, condensed and vanished, bound briefly to minerals before being released again. Earth tasted water without remembering it. The conditions were not yet right for holding. Still, something important was happening. Each loss taught the planet what it lacked. Each failure thickened the lesson. Earth's interior cooled incrementally, not steadily but persistently. With every cycle of melting and solidifying, heat escaped a little more slowly. With every rearrangement, the body became harder to fully erase. Memory sank inward, away from the surface where impacts spoke loudly. The moon watched this without comment. It circled Earth faithfully, a consequence rather than a companion, drawing tides in magma long before oceans could respond. Its presence steadied Earth's rotation, slowed its turning, stretched its days into durations that would later matter. Even now, before remembering, Earth was being prepared. Prepared does not mean ready, it means not impossible. Silence continued to protect Earth's orbit, allowing it to repeat without frequent catastrophe. Yet the inner solar system still carried danger. Fragments crossed paths, some struck, some missed. Each encounter reshaped the planet's surface but left its deeper structure more intact than before. Earth was learning depth. Its crusts grew thicker between impacts, then thinner again when struck. Each cycle left behind compositional scars, regions richer in certain elements, zones altered by heat and pressure. These scars were not recorded anywhere visible. They were embedded, waiting. Time continued to pass without measurement. Millions of years unfolded quietly, not as progress, but as accumulation. Earth remained hostile to memory at the surface, but hospitable to continuity beneath. This distinction would matter later. For now, it simply existed. Earth before memory was not chaos. It was vulnerability. A state where everything could still be undone, but nothing was easily erased. A condition balanced between loss and retention, between fire and silence, between becoming and forgetting. Some truths cannot be held until the ground learns how to stay still. Earth had not learned that yet, but it was learning, slowly, unnoticed, under a sky that did not yet exist. Earth did not resist forgetting. It endured it. For a long while, erasure arrived often enough to feel ordinary. Impacts still came, fewer than before, slower, heavier, each one arriving like a question the planet had to answer without language. Could this shape remain? Could this surface survive? The answers changed each time. Sometimes yes, often no. But the asking itself began to matter less than what remained afterward. Each strike rearranged the surface, but something subtle shifted beneath. The interior no longer reset completely, heat redistributed rather than escaped. Material sorted itself again, but along pathways already worn by earlier rearrangements. Memory did not disappear. It sank. Earth learned the difference between surface and self. Molten seas spread across the planet after major impacts, glowing briefly then dimming as they radiated energy into space. These oceans of stone did not last. They cooled, cracked, hardened, only to be erased again later. But every cooling left behind a slightly thicker crust, a slightly deeper separation between what could be lost and what would remain. Depth accumulated quietly. Inside, convection continued its patient work. Heat rose from the core, released itself upward, then sank again, carrying with it the legacy of formation. These motions were slow enough to ignore, but persistent enough to matter. They stitched continuity into the planet's interior long before the surface could hold still long enough to notice. Earth's gravity grew more assured. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but enough that escape became less certain. Gases released from the interior lingered longer before drifting away. Some returned, some did not. The difference was not consistency, but possibility. Possibility had arrived. An atmosphere tried again, not as sky, not as breath, but as a thin, shifting veil that gathered and scattered repeatedly. It did not stay long. Solar wind still brushed much of it away. Heat still encouraged loss. But the planet noticed, in its own way, that not everything vanished immediately anymore. Retention began as delay. Water followed a similar rhythm. It condensed briefly, pooled in transient basins, seeped into fractures, then escaped again as vapor. Earth did not yet know how to keep water on its surface, but it learned how to hold it inside minerals, locking it into rock where loss was slower. Memory hid in chemistry. The moon continued its silent work. It drew tides through molten interiors, flexing the planet rhythmically, dissipating energy in slow pulses. This friction warmed Earth from within, extending the time it would take to cool completely. The days lengthened. Rotation slowed. Time stretched itself into a more generous shape. Earth did not notice this, but it benefited from it. Silence still protected the planet's orbit. Major disruptions grew rarer. The solar system had matured enough to allow Earth long intervals between catastrophes. These intervals were crucial. They allowed crusts to cool further. They allowed atmospheres to attempt permanence again. They allowed interior motions to complete cycles rather than being interrupted mid-thought. In these intervals, Earth practiced continuity. Its surface remained unstable, but less so. Some regions cooled and stayed cool longer than others. High ground persisted briefly. Low regions filled with transient melts. Differentiation crept upward, closer to the surface with each cycle. The planet began to exhibit preferences, not intentional but structural. Earth was no longer uniform. This unevenness mattered. It created places where certain processes could linger longer than elsewhere. Places where cooling happened faster. Places where materials accumulated. Places where erasure arrived more slowly. Place began to exist in principle. Time continued its quiet passing. Tens of millions of years folded into one another without announcement. Earth remained hostile to memory at the surface, but increasingly welcoming to it below. The distinction sharpened. Earth was learning to compartmentalize forgetting. What could not be kept above was buried. What could not endure exposure was hidden. What survived did so by sinking, not by resisting. This strategy would define the planet long before anything living learned to do the same. The sun's light remained steady, but the young star was still more active than it would later become. Bursts of radiation stripped atmospheres, heated surfaces, challenged retention. Earth endured these without protest. Each loss taught it where its thresholds lay. Thresholds are teachers. By the end of this long phase, Earth was still unrecognizable as a world. No oceans stayed, no sky held, no surface remembered its shape for long. Yet beneath the noise of erasure, a quieter truth had settled in. Earth could now change without becoming nothing. This was not memory yet, but it was the condition that made memory possible. The planet had not learned how to remember, but it had learned how not to forget everything, and that difference, small, quiet, easily missed, would shape everything that followed. For what endures loss long enough eventually learns what it can keep. Earth learned endurance before it learned calm. The planet did not wake one day to stability. It drifted into it gradually, carried by long intervals where nothing catastrophic arrived to interrupt the slow work happening beneath its surface. These intervals mattered more than the impacts that still came. They allowed processes to finish what they began. They allowed heat to move without being forced to flee. They allowed layers to settle into something resembling persistence. Silence thickened around the planet. Not complete silence, never complete, but sufficient quiet for continuity to deepen. Between collisions, crusts cooled longer than before. Fractures sealed. Minerals rearranged themselves into patterns that resisted immediate reversal. Earth began to hold on to shape, not indefinitely, but long enough to matter. Inside, the core remained restless but contained. Heavy elements stayed anchored, circulating energy upward in slow, measured currents. These currents fed the mantle, which moved with patience rather than urgency. Stone flowed invisibly, carrying memory upward, only to release it gently and sink again. This circulation was Earth's first long thought. The surface responded unevenly. Some regions cooled faster, thickening into early protocrust that lingered across ages. Other regions remained thin, vulnerable, easily erased. This unevenness introduced difference, zones that behaved differently under the same conditions. Difference allowed complexity to begin, even before anything could notice it. Earth learned that sameness was fragile. Atmosphere tried again, and this time it lingered longer. Gases released from the interior rose and did not immediately vanish. Some escaped, some returned, some accumulated briefly before being lost. The difference was subtle but real. Retention had shifted from impossible to uncertain. Uncertainty is progress. Water followed these changes closely. It condensed more frequently now, pooling in transient basins that lasted longer than before. It infiltrated fractures, reacted with rock, altered minerals. Each interaction left a trace, locking the water into chemistry where loss was slower. Earth began to store water without yet knowing how to display it. Storage preceded surface. The moon's influence continued quietly, stabilizing Earth's tilt, moderating its rotation. The days lengthened further, giving surfaces more time to cool between solar warmth. This mattered. Slower rotation meant gentler gradients, less violent transitions between heat and cold. Extremes softened. Softening allowed endurance. Solar activity still challenged the planet. Bursts of radiation stripped atmosphere, heated surfaces, tested retention repeatedly. Earth did not resist these challenges directly. It adapted by hiding what it could, burying volatiles, thickening crusts, slowing loss. Each challenge refined the strategy. Earth was learning where to keep its secrets. Time passed in spans too long to feel like change. Millions of years folded quietly into one another. Impacts still arrived, but they no longer reset everything. They altered surfaces without undoing interiors. They became chapters rather than erasures. This distinction mattered profoundly. The planet now carried continuity beneath change. Its deeper layers remembered conditions that the surface forgot repeatedly. Memory was no longer impossible, it was simply inaccessible from above. Earth before memory was not empty. It was layered. Layer upon layer of experience buried beneath surfaces that refused to stay still. Each layer preserved information about pressure, temperature, composition. These were not stories, they were conditions held long enough to shape what came next. The solar system continued to allow this slow work. Silence still guarded Earth's orbit. Major disturbances grew rarer. The planet remained vulnerable but no longer helpless. Earth was learning to wait. Waiting does not look like progress, it looks like a thing happening. But beneath the appearance of stasis, something irreversible had taken root. The planet could now support long-term processes without losing itself in the attempt. It could host cycles that required patience rather than reaction. This was the threshold. Not the threshold of life, not the threshold of oceans or air, the threshold of memory's possibility. Earth had not yet remembered anything, but it had become capable of remembering. Some truths require ground that does not move too often. Earth was becoming that ground. Earth learned patience before it learned peace. The planet did not arrive at stability all at once. It approached it the way stone cools, unevenly, reluctantly, never fully at rest. There were still moments of upheaval, still arrivals from the dark that struck with enough force to remind the surface how easily it could be rewritten. But these moments no longer defined everything that followed them. Between them, Earth endured. Crusts thickened in places where cooling had lasted long enough to matter. These regions resisted erasure longer than their surroundings, holding shape across ages that once would have undone them completely. They were fragile, yes, but fragile in a way that could be repaired rather than erased. Crack sealed, melt cooled, continuity survived interruption. Inside, motion slowed further. The mantle's circulation settled into rhythms that no longer changed their paths with each disturbance. Heat moved upward, predictably, released itself, then sank again. The core remained dense and warm, turning quietly, generating subtle forces that would one day matter far more than anyone could imagine. For now, they simply existed, another layer of continuity hidden beneath the surface. Earth's gravity continued its gradual strengthening. Escape was still possible, but less frequent. Atmosphere lingered longer with each attempt. Gases built up not into a sky, but into a presence, a weight above the surface that stayed long enough to interact, to be altered, to leave traces behind even when it departed again. These traces mattered. Chemical reactions occurred between air and rock, altering surfaces, binding elements into new arrangements that did not vanish when the gases did. Each interaction changed the surface slightly, making it more receptive to the next. Earth was learning through repetition rather than retention. Water followed the same pattern. It appeared, pooled briefly, seeped into fractures, reacted with minerals, then vanished again. But each appearance left a record in chemistry. Hydrated minerals, altered rock, softened surfaces. Earth did not yet keep water. It remembered where water had been. Memory began as imprint. The moon continued its distant work, holding Earth's rotation in a slower, steadier rhythm. Tides moved through molten layers beneath the crust, redistributing heat without noise. These motions extended the planet's warmth, delaying complete cooling long enough for deeper organization to continue. The sun's influence remained constant, but the young star's intensity still tested the planet's ability to keep what it gathered. Earth endured these tests not by resisting, but by adjusting. Burying volatiles, thickening crusts, slowing loss. Adjustment is a form of learning. Over immense spans of time, Earth crossed another quiet threshold. Its surface, while still restless, no longer reset completely after major events. Some features persisted long enough to be altered rather than erased. Highlands rose and remained. Basins formed and deepened. Relief began to exist in principle. Surface began to differentiate. This differentiation created places where processes lingered, where cooling happened faster, where materials accumulated, where reactions repeated. Place, once an abstraction, became structural. Earth was no longer uniform even briefly. Difference became persistent. Time deepened again. Millions of years passed without the planet losing itself. Impacts arrived, but they added chapters rather than restarting the story. The solar system's silence continued to protect Earth's orbit, allowing this accumulation to continue without frequent interruption. Earth before memory was still hostile to recognition. No sky reflected itself. No ocean held continuity. But beneath the surface, something essential had stabilized. The planet could now carry long-term change without erasing its past. This capacity was not visible. It was not dramatic, but it was irreversible. Earth had learned to endure itself. Memory had not arrived yet. But forgetting had learned its limits. And once forgetting is constrained, remembering becomes only a matter of time. For what can hold shape long enough eventually holds story. Earth became quiet enough to hear itself. Not in sound, in duration. There came a long stretch of time when nothing decisive arrived from the dark. No great impact rewrote the surface from edge to edge. No sudden surge of radiation stripped everything away at once. The solar system, now older, now disciplined by distance and silence, allowed Earth to remain mostly uninterrupted. This allowance mattered more than any gift. Crusts that had once been temporary learned how to stay. They did not become permanent, not yet, but they endured long enough to be shaped rather than erased. Cooling happened in layers. Fractures formed and healed repeatedly, thickening the surface through memory of stress rather than resistance to it. Stone learned where it had broken before, and adjusted. Inside the planet, motion slowed into something almost thoughtful. Heat still rose, but not in urgency. It moved because it had nowhere else to go. Convection traced loops that lasted longer than ages once had. These loops redistributed energy gently, smoothing extremes, encouraging balance rather than release. The core turned steadily, heavy and sure, carrying with it forces that reached outward without being seen. Magnetism began as a quiet side effect of endurance, motion sustained long enough to matter. Earth did not yet know protection, but it was learning how to produce it. Above, atmosphere tried again. This time it did not vanish quickly. Gases gathered, lingered, thinned, returned. Loss still happened, but not completely. Earth's gravity, now confident enough, kept a portion close. Silence between solar outbursts allowed accumulation. Time stitched thin veils of air into something continuous. Still fragile, still incomplete, but no longer fleeting. Water followed. It condensed more often now, falling not just briefly but repeatedly, collecting in low regions that lasted long enough to be altered by its presence. Basins deepened, rock softened, chemistry shifted. Water began to shape surface rather than merely visit it. Earth did not yet keep oceans, but it was learning how to remember where they wanted to be. The moon continued its patient guidance, stretching Earth's days into gentler rhythms, stabilizing tilt, preventing wild swings that would have erased progress. This companionship was not chosen, it was inherited, and it mattered more than either body could ever know. Time continued its long work. The surface was still dangerous, still unstable, still vulnerable to loss, but beneath that vulnerability lay something new, continuity that could survive interruption. Earth could now be struck and remain itself, altered, but not undone. This was the quiet completion of forgetting. Earth had fully forgotten how to be unfinished. Not complete, not calm, but no longer provisional. The planet before memory had become a place where memory could one day exist. Its ground could now hold shape long enough for cycles to repeat without erasing themselves. Its interior could sustain processes across immense spans. Its surface could be changed rather than reset. This was not the arrival of life. Not yet. It was the arrival of ground. Ground is memory waiting. What followed would not come from the sky alone or the depths alone. It would emerge from interaction, between air that stayed, water that returned, stone that endured, and time that no longer hurried past. Earth did not remember yet, but it had become capable of remembering, and that capability, once earned, is never lost entirely. Some truths sleep beneath surfaces until the world becomes quiet enough to hold them. Earth had become that quiet, and as the planet turned beneath a sun that had learned restraint, wrapped in an orbit guarded by sequence, the next chapter of the story waited, not in fire or stone alone, but in what would soon begin to linger between them. The moon was never meant to arrive gently. It did not drift in. It did not settle politely into place. It came from violence so complete that only distance could soften its memory. Long before Earth learned how to keep a surface, before it could trust its own gravity to hold air or water without hesitation, there was an impact so profound that it reshaped what Earth was allowed to become. Not an ending, a division. A moment when too much motion arrived at once and the only way forward was separation. Earth met another body, large enough to matter, close enough to change everything. The collision did not explode outward in chaos. It unfolded inward, folding matter into heat, lifting rock into orbit, tearing memory from the surface and casting it into space. Earth lost part of itself, but what it lost did not disappear. It stayed nearby. The debris did not scatter into silence. It circled. Heated, molten fragments traced glowing arcs around the wounded planet, refusing to leave. Gravity held them close even as they drifted outward. Earth, still learning confidence, did not pull everything back. Instead, it allowed distance to form. Distance became mercy. From this ring of broken surface, something gathered. Not quickly, not cleanly. Material collided, melted, cooled, collided again. What formed was not Earth, but something shaped by Earth's loss, a body made from what Earth could not yet keep. The moon did not inherit Earth's core, it inherited its surface. It carried with it the chemistry of exposure, the lighter materials, the crustal fragments, the memory of early impacts. What Earth buried inward, the moon lifted outward. This division mattered more than size or brightness ever could. The moon was memory displaced. As it gathered itself, the moon cooled faster than Earth ever could. Smaller, exposed, unprotected, its surface hardened into permanence long before Earth's did. What struck the moon remained written. Craters did not heal, scars did not sink inward. The moon remembered everything it endured. Earth could not do this yet. Earth was still too alive with heat, too restless with motion. Its surface erased itself repeatedly, forgetting what it could not yet afford to hold. The moon became the keeper of what Earth had to release. This was not companionship. It was division of labour. As the moon settled into orbit, its presence began to matter immediately. Gravity stretched invisible threads between the two bodies. Earth's rotation slowed, its days lengthening into shapes that could hold change more gently. Tides moved through molten layers beneath the crust, dissipating energy in slow rhythmic pulses. These pulses mattered. They softened extremes. They extended warmth. They gave Earth more time between states. The moon did not touch Earth again. It did not need to. Its distance did the work. By pulling and releasing rhythmically, the moon helped Earth lose energy without losing itself. It encouraged internal motion without catastrophe. It guided rather than commanded. Earth learned restraint through this constant wordless conversation. The moon learned stillness. Locked in its own rotation, it turned one face toward Earth forever, holding its memory in plain sight. What it carried remained visible, unedited by erosion or tectonics. Its surface became a record of the solar system's earlier violence, an archive written in silence. Earth did not read this record. Not yet, but it depended on it. Because the moon carried what Earth could not yet keep, Earth was free to forget in order to become something else, free to bury heat, to rearrange interiors, to allow surfaces to heal rather than remember. Memory was outsourced so continuity could deepen. The moon did not evolve beyond this role. It did not need to. It stayed. It watched. It kept time by reflecting light that had already learned how to stay steady. And as Earth continued its slow learning, how to hold air, how to keep water, how to remember without being overwhelmed, the moon circled patiently, carrying the burden of early memory without asking Earth to look at it. Some memories must be held at a distance, not forgotten, just placed where they cannot interrupt becoming. The moon was that place. Distance taught the moon how to endure. Once gathered into a single body, it no longer burned with the heat of its birth. It cooled quickly, surrendering its warmth to space without resistance. There was no atmosphere to soften the loss, no oceans to redistribute energy. The moon accepted exposure as its condition and learned permanence through it. What cooled stayed. Its surface hardened into a stillness Earth could not yet afford. Each impact carved a scar that remained open, unhealed, preserved exactly as it arrived. Craters did not soften. They did not sink. They waited. The moon became a ledger of violence written without erasure. Earth watched this only through gravity. Between them, invisible threads tightened into rhythm. The moon's pull reached into Earth's depths, stirring molten layers beneath the crust. Tides moved through rock long before they ever touched water. These movements were slow and insistent, redistributing energy in patterns that repeated faithfully. Repetition changed Earth more than force ever could. With each tidal cycle, Earth lost a little spin. Days lengthened, stretching heat and cold across longer intervals. Extremes softened. Surfaces cooled more evenly. The planet became less frantic, less vulnerable to sudden swings that would have undone progress. The moon did not intend this. It simply stayed where it was. As Earth's rotation slowed, time reshaped itself. Processes that required patience found room to operate. Cooling deepened. Differentiation refined itself further. The planet's interior continued to organize without being rushed back into chaos by rapid change. The moon was not a companion. It was a regulator. Its gravity stabilized Earth's tilt, preventing wild variations that would have erased continuity again and again. Without this steadiness, climates would one day swing violently, surfaces would reset endlessly, and memory would struggle to remain. The moon did not create balance, it held it in place. Balance requires distance. As the moon circled, it moved slowly outward, carrying with it the memory of Earth's early violence. This drift was gentle, barely noticeable over ages, but it mattered. It adjusted rhythms gradually, ensuring change arrived stretched thin rather than abruptly. Earth benefited without noticing. Meanwhile, the moon remained unchanged. Without atmosphere, without internal heat strong enough to drive renewal, it froze into its role completely. Its interior cooled and quieted. Its surface became a museum of impacts no longer happening elsewhere. The solar system aged, the moon remembered. Fragments that once threatened Earth now struck the moon instead, intercepted by its presence. Some were drawn away, some collided. Each crater spared Earth a blow, reducing interruption, increasing interval. Silence deepened around the planet. Protection did not arrive as a shield. It arrived as diversion. Earth's surface continued to cool and thicken. Atmosphere lingered longer. Water returned more frequently. Each return lasted longer than the last. These changes were subtle, cumulative, dependent on time uninterrupted. The moon provided that time. By holding Earth's past at a distance, it allowed Earth's future to gather itself without constant reference to violence. What Earth needed to forget, the moon kept visible elsewhere. What Earth needed to remember, it buried beneath layers of continuity. This separation of memory was essential. Some worlds remember everything and cannot move forward. Some forget everything and cannot endure. Earth learned to do both by dividing the burden. The moon's face, locked toward Earth, reflected steady light back across the planet's surface. Night became predictable, darkness gained rhythm, rest became possible long before anything living required it. The moon did not shine on purpose, it simply returned what it received. As the ages continued, the moon's role did not diminish. It remained quiet, constant, unchanging. Its very stillness became its contribution. It did not evolve. It allowed Earth to. The solar system accepted this arrangement without ceremony. Two bodies bound by loss and distance, shaping one another through restraint rather than contact. The moon carried what Earth couldn't, so Earth could become what it was not yet. And as Earth continued its whole approach toward remembering, toward holding air, water and surface long enough for stories to begin, the moon stayed just far enough away to keep early memory from overwhelming the future. Some companions exist not to walk beside, but to remain where they are. The moon learned stillness by having nowhere else to go. Locked in its turning, one face always offered, the other always withheld to the more end. This was not choice, it was consequence. Rotation and orbit folded into one another until motion itself forgot how to vary. The moon became a body that moved without changing its expression, a witness condemned to consistency. Consistency became its gift. While Earth continued to shift beneath thickening crusts and restless interiors, the moon remained unchanged enough to remember what Earth erased. Every impact that struck its surface stayed visible, unsoftened by air or water, unblurred by tectonics. The moon did not heal, it archived. Earth needed this. Not because it would one day read those records, though it would, but because remembering everything too soon can prevent becoming anything else. Earth was still learning how to keep continuity alive beneath change. The moon absorbed the excess history so Earth could keep moving forward without being anchored to its earliest wounds. Distance made this possible. The gravitational thread between them never loosened, but it stretched. With each passing age, the moon drifted slightly farther away, slowing Earth's spin further, lengthening days into gentler durations. This was not loss, it was release, stretched thin enough to be useful rather than destructive. Longer days softened contrasts. Heat had more time to spread. Cold retreated more gradually. The surface learned moderation not by design but by rhythm. Extremes dulled. Continuity strengthened. Earth's climate, still primitive, still unstable, began to experience patterns that repeated rather than reset. Patterns are the language memory uses. Tides continued to move through Earth's interior, flexing rock that had not yet learned how to remain still. These motions dissipated energy quietly, converting violent rotation into gentle heat spread across time. Earth cooled more evenly. Crust stabilized. The boundary between surface and depth grew clearer. The moon did not command this, it allowed it. In the night sky that did not yet exist, the moon traced a predictable path. Its presence turned darkness into something structured. Shadows gained rhythm, absence learned repetition. These patterns mattered long before anything could see them. Elsewhere in the solar system, other worlds did not share this gift. Without companions to moderate their motion, some spun wildly, others froze into stillness too quickly. Extremes ruled their evolution. Earth's difference was not size or position alone, it was relationship. The moon was Earth's first relationship, not chosen, not gentle, but enduring. As time continued, the moon's interior cooled fully. Its geological activity faded into silence. What little heat remained hid deep within, never resurfacing. The moon became a surface world, one where the exterior told the whole story because nothing inside insisted on rewriting it. Earth was not ready for this yet. Earth needed interior motion to continue. It needed heat to linger. It needed surfaces that could break and heal. The moon carried the opposite condition, a body where nothing healed and nothing changed. Together they formed a balance neither could achieve alone. One remembered everything. One forgot enough to continue. Fragments still arrived from time to time, but fewer now. When they did, the moon often received them instead of Earth, intercepting chaos through proximity rather than defense. Each crater carved into lunar stone was an impact Earth did not endure. Protection arrived as displacement. As Earth's atmosphere grew thicker, its surface began to hide scars more effectively. Wind and water would one day erase marks that the moon preserved forever. Memory moved inward on Earth, outward on the moon. This division would shape both worlds permanently. The moon did not envy Earth's change. Earth did not resent the moon's stillness. They existed in parallel, bound by gravity, separated by role. One carried the record of what had been, the other prepared for what could be. As Earth edged closer to holding water, air, and surface, long enough for cycles to matter, the moon continued to hold distance steady, rotation slow, memory external. Some truths are too heavy to carry while becoming. The moon carried them instead. And as both bodies continued their long, quiet dance, one changing, one unchanged, the solar system accepted this pairing as complete, a wound that became balance, a loss that became structure. But even this division was not the end of preparation, for soon, what Earth learned to hold would begin to change it from above and below, not through impact or fire, but through the slow gathering of breath. And breath requires a sky. The moon completed its task by refusing to change. As ages passed and the solar system settled deeper into maturity, the moon remained exactly what it had become, silent, exposed, uncorrected. Its surface did not forget. It did not soften its scars or rearrange its layers. It accepted each mark as permanent, allowing time to stack memory without interruption. Earth needed here this permanence elsewhere. While the moon held still, Earth continued its quiet becoming. Its surface healed and broke again. Each cycle buried history deeper, protecting it from erasure by hiding it beneath newer layers. What the moon kept visible, Earth folded inward. This difference was not accidental, it was essential. Distance held the balance. The moon's orbit, now wider than before, slowed Earth's turning into something almost gentle. Days lengthened enough for cooling to finish what it began. Nights lingered long enough for heat to escape without shock. Rhythm softened, stretched into durations that allowed continuity to thicken. Continuity needs time to breathe. The gravitational conversation between Earth and Moon never ceased. It only quieted. Tides moved through solid stone beneath Earth's crust, flexing it just enough to prevent stagnation, never enough to fracture identity. Energy was redistributed rather than released. Extremes dissolved into pattern. Earth became teachable. The moon, meanwhile, became complete in its stillness. Its interior cooled into silence. Its orbit stabilized. Its role no longer evolved. It had finished becoming what it needed to be, a memory keeper placed at the right distance, carrying the burden of early violence so Earth could release it. This release mattered. Without it, Earth would have remained trapped in its earliest wounds, unable to move forward without constantly reopening them. The moon allowed forgetting without loss. It made room for Earth to build something new without denying what had happened. Memory does not always belong where it was made. Sometimes it must be moved so growth can continue. As the solar system aged, impacts grew rare. The moon's scarred face preserved the history of that decline, a visible record of when chaos faded into quiet. Earth's surface showed no such clarity. Its memory had moved underground, into structure rather than appearance. Two worlds, one history, carried differently. The sun's steady light continued to bind them, marking time without interference. Night and day now repeated with dependable rhythm, darkness gained structure, light learned where to return. These cycles prepared Earth for processes that required patience beyond geology. The Moon did not participate in those processes. It enabled them. By holding Earth's tilt steady, by moderating rotation, by intercepting chaos, the Moon created a long calm, an interval wide enough for air to gather, for water to stay, for surfaces to persist. The Moon never entered Earth's future directly. It stayed beside it. Some companions exist not to change, but to remain unchanged so others can. The Moon carried what Earth could not: violence, excess memory, exposed history, and in doing so freed Earth to become a world capable of holding gentler stories. As this chapter closed, Earth was no longer alone in its remembering. Its past rested safely at a distance, visible but no longer overwhelming. Its future waited closer now, shaped by what could finally remain. What came next would not arrive through stone or impact or fire. It would arrive through accumulation so delicate it required everything learned so far: breath, sky, a thinness held long enough to matter. The Moon stayed where it was, and Earth at last was ready to look upward without being undone. Air does not arrive all at once. It gathers. It gathers the way silence once did, by staying longer than expected, by lingering just past the moment when loss would have felt inevitable, by returning again and again until presence becomes habit. For a long time, Earth could not keep air. Not because air refused the planet, but because the planet could not yet hold it. Heat drove gases upward and away, solar wind brushed them aside, gravity hesitated, unsure of its own authority. Each attempt at breath thinned into absence. The sky arrived and vanished so often it never learned its shape. But Earth had changed. The ground beneath these losses had thickened. The interior had steadied. Rotation had slowed into gentler days. Silence between catastrophes had grown wide enough to matter, and the Moon remained where it was, holding rhythm steady, guarding the interval. Air noticed this. Gases released from Earth's interior rose again, but this time they lingered. Not all of them, not confidently, but enough to change the question. Loss became delay. Delay became possibility. Possibility is how retention begins. Carbon dioxide gathered. Nitrogen accumulated. Water vapor joined briefly, then returned again. The mixture was unstable, reactive, hostile to anything familiar. But it stayed longer than before, long enough to press lightly against the surface, long enough to interact. Pressure arrived quietly. It was not yet sky. It was weight above ground. This weight mattered. It slowed escape. It softened transitions between heat and cold. It allowed surfaces to cool without shocking themselves back into fracture. Air did not protect Earth. It moderated it. Moderation changes everything slowly. Rain did not fall yet, not as cycle or system. But condensation occurred more often. Water vapor cooled, gathered, returned to stone. Each return altered chemistry. Rock weathered not by violence, but by patience. Minerals loosened, surfaces softened. Earth began to change from above as well as below. Air taught stone a new language. The sun still challenged retention. Bursts of radiation thinned the atmosphere repeatedly. But Earth responded differently now. What was lost returned more quickly. What escaped was replaced. Balance did not arrive, but resilience did. Resilience is repetition that survives interruption. The growing atmosphere absorbed energy, redistributed it, carried warmth across distances that had once been too extreme. Nights cooled less brutally, days warmed less violently, temperature learned continuity, extremes softened. This mattered. Inside the planet, heat continued its slow circulation. Above, air began to join the conversation. Earth's surface now existed between two influences, interior motion and atmospheric presence, neither dominant, both shaping. Earth was becoming layered not just in stone but in condition. The Moon watched from its steady distance, unaffected by air it could not keep. Its role remained unchanged, but its influence echoed here, in every lengthened day, in every moderated night, in every interval wide enough for accumulation to matter. Air does not remember like stone. It forgets constantly, but it forgets by mixing rather than erasing, by carrying traces forward even as it rearranges them. Memory in air is not location. It is circulation. Circulation began. Winds formed not as systems, but as tendencies, warmth rising, coolness sinking, pressure equalizing itself without knowing why. Motion in the sky mirrored motion in the mantle, slower, gentler, more visible. Earth was learning coherence. Still, this air was not gentle. It was thick with carbon dioxide, hostile to what would one day breathe it. Oxygen was rare, fleeting, quickly claimed by rock. The sky carried no promise yet, only presence. Presence was enough. For the first time, Earth could lose air without losing all of it. It could be stripped and recover. It could be disturbed and persist. This difference, small as it was, marked another threshold crossed. Earth had learned to keep thinness. Thinness is fragile, but fragility that lasts becomes structure. The sky was not finished. It was not kind. It was not ready, but it stayed. And staying, as the planet had learned again and again, is how entirely new stories begin. Air learned patience by moving, not quickly, not decisively, but often enough to become familiar with itself. As Earth turned beneath its thinning veil, the atmosphere began to circulate with more confidence. Warmth rose where sunlight lingered. Coolness, Shoukuan, sank where darkness stayed longer. These motions were not storms. They were habits forming, paths traced so many times they began to feel inevitable. The sky was learning repetition. Pressure differences smoothed themselves out gradually, like breath finding its rhythm after sleep. Nothing here rushed toward but balance. Balance emerged because nothing interrupted the process often enough to stop it. Silence between extremes allowed air to remember where it had been. Circulation became memory. Gases mixed endlessly, carrying traces of surface and interior from place to place. Volcanic breath rose, spread, thinned, returned. Water vapor lifted from warm ground, travelled, condensed and fell again. Each cycle left behind subtle changes. Minerals altered, surfaces softened, chemistry rearranged. Rain was not yet rain, but return had begun. When water condensed, it did not fall gently. It struck hot stone, hissed, vanished, rose again. Yet even this brief contact mattered. It etched pathways into rock, carved places where water would one day prefer to linger. Earth learned where water wanted to go long before it learned how to keep it there. The sky watched and moved. Carbon dioxide remained dominant, thick and heavy, trapping warmth close to the surface. The planet stayed hot, but not uniformly. Air redistributed heat across distances, preventing extremes from ruling entirely. Nights cooled without freezing everything solid. Days warmed without boiling everything away. Moderation arrived invisibly. The sun's energy no longer struck bare stone alone. It interacted with air, for it scattered, absorbed, re-emitted. Light softened. Shadows blurred. The surface experienced warmth as a gradient rather than a blow. This changed how Earth aged. Rock weathered more evenly. Chemical reactions slowed into persistence rather than shock. Surfaces altered without needing to melt. The planet's face began to change without being erased. Air had become a collaborator. Still, the sky remained unstable. Solar radiation continued to strip gases away. Loss still happened, but the pace had changed. What escaped was replaced more quickly. What returned stayed longer. Earth had crossed from fragility into resilience. Resilience is not permanence, it is recovery that outpaces loss. Water vapor continued to cycle, growing more abundant with each age. Some water remained locked inside minerals, some escaped to space. Some lingered longer near the surface, gathering in shallow depressions that lasted just long enough to be reshaped by their presence. Pools formed, vanished, returned. Each return deepened the basin. Air carried sound now, though nothing listened. Winds brushed surfaces, moving ash, dust, vapor. These motions rearranged the surface subtly, teaching Earth the difference between exposure and shelter. Low places collected, high places shed, place learned preference. Above it all, the moon traced its steady path, marking time through repetition rather than change. Its presence continued to moderate Earth's rotation, allowing air more time to respond, more time to circulate, more time to learn. Longer days meant gentler transitions. Heat spread, cold retreated, air flowed rather than rushed. The atmosphere thickened incrementally, pressure increased. The surface felt this weight not as burden, but as continuity. Volcanic gases rose into a sky that now existed long enough to receive them. Some reacted, forming new compounds that did not escape easily. Nitrogen accumulated quietly. It did not react much. It stayed. This staying mattered more than activity. It added bulk to the atmosphere without demanding change. It created background pressure that allowed other processes to operate without being undone immediately. Nitrogen became the sky's patience. Oxygen appeared briefly, then vanished, bound into rock almost as soon as it formed. Earth was not ready for it yet. The surface claimed it quickly, hungry for reaction. Oxygen learned humility by disappearing. But disappearance is not erasure. Traces remained locked in minerals, waiting for conditions to change. Air was not finished learning. It was still volatile, still hostile, still restless. Yet it had crossed a threshold no surface alone could achieve. It could now act as a medium, a space where interactions could occur repeatedly without starting over each time. Medium is memory in motion. The sky did not yet protect life. It protected process. It held warmth. It carried water. It softened light. It allowed repetition. Earth was no longer bare stone beneath a star. It was a world wrapped in breath that stayed long enough to matter. And in that breath, in that movement without urgency, another possibility began to gather, not visible, not inevitable, but quietly present. For air that can keep itself can one day keep something else. But that story waits. Air learned weight by carrying time, not all at once, not everywhere, but long enough in enough places for change to stop undoing itself. As the ages turned, the atmosphere thickened by accumulation rather than arrival. Volcanoes continued their slow exhale, releasing gases from depths that had held them since the planet was young. Each breath added a little more presence to the sky. Loss still occurred, but replacement now outpaced it. The balance tipped quietly, pressure deepened. The surface felt this as steadiness. Heat no longer escaped instantly, cold no longer arrived as shock. Transitions softened into gradients that could be crossed without rupture. The planet's skin began to behave less like a wound and more like a boundary. Boundaries make memory possible. Air now pressed gently against stone, interacting with it continuously rather than briefly. Chemical weathering became persistent. Minerals altered not through violence but through long exposure. Iron rusted invisibly. Silicates softened. The surface learned how to change without melting. This was new. Water vapor increased with each cycle, returning more often, lingering longer. Condensation gathered into rains that no longer vanished instantly upon contact. Some water ran, some pooled, some seeped downward and stayed. Earth began to taste continuity in liquid form, still no oceans, but something closer. The sky moved this water across the surface, redistributing it from where it arrived to where it was needed to stay. Winds pushed clouds toward cooler regions. Rain fell unevenly, carving preference into the ground. Valleys deepened. Channels hinted at paths that would one day remain. Air taught water how to wander. With this wandering came erosion. Not catastrophic, not sudden, but patient. Stone wore down grain by grain. High places lowered, low places gathered. The surface began to smooth its extremes without losing its character. Character emerged as pattern. The sun's light now filtered through a thicker veil, scattering and softening. Ultraviolet radiation still arrived, but less brutally. Some wavelengths were absorbed, others redirected. The sky began to act as shield not by blocking, but by mediating. Mediation changes survival. Earth's surface grew less hostile to persistence. Temperatures stabilized across broader regions. Extremes still existed, but they no longer dominated everything they touched. The planet's face became more varied, more forgiving. Air carried energy as well as matter. Warmth moved poleward. Coolness drifted equatorward. These motions were slow, incomplete, but real. They allowed regions to share excess rather than hoard it. The planet learned cooperation without intention. Above it all, the moon's steady rhythm continued to stretch days into shapes air could use. Longer daylight meant longer heating. Longer night meant gentler cooling. The atmosphere responded by circulating rather than collapsing. Rotation and breath learned harmony. Oxygen still appeared only briefly, stolen quickly by rock and gas eager to react. But each appearance left a trace behind. Oxidized minerals, altered chemistry, subtle shifts in the surface's appetite. Earth was preparing itself for something it did not yet know how to host. Preparation looks like repetition. Nitrogen continued to accumulate quietly, adding bulk without drama. It became the background against which everything else happened. Pressure increased not because of excitement, but because nothing removed it fast enough. The sky learned inertia. Once present, it resisted disappearance. Once thick enough, it protected itself by slowing loss. The atmosphere crossed another quiet threshold, the point where staying became easier than leaving. This threshold changed the future. Water now lingered long enough to gather into more persistent basins. Lakes formed and remained across ages rather than seasons. Some evaporated, some refilled, but they returned to the same places again and again. Earth was learning geography. Geography is memory written in surface. Air, water, and stone began to act together rather than separately. Processes overlapped, changes compounded. What happened in the sky shaped the ground. What happened in the ground shaped the sky. Feedback replaced isolation. Feedback allows complexity. The planet was no longer simply enduring, it was interacting with itself. This interaction did not produce life, not yet, but it produced stability layered enough to allow delicate things to survive long enough to matter. It created cycles that repeated without erasing their own effects. It created conditions that could remember yesterday without needing to start over tomorrow. Air had learned how to keep weight. Water had learned how to return. Stone had learned how to endure. Together, they formed a system capable of holding more than itself. Something quiet waited within that capability, not as miracle, not as destiny, but as consequence. When breath can stay, when water can linger, when ground can remember, the world begins to whisper in new ways. But those whispers had not yet learned how to listen. That story waits just ahead, folded into chemistry, patience, and time that no longer rushed past. Air completed its lesson not by thickening further, but by staying consistent. There came a time when the sky no longer felt temporary. Loss still happened, always, but it no longer defined the atmosphere's existence. Gases escaped and returned in cycles slow enough to be measured, gentle enough to be endured. The balance no longer tipped back and forth. It rested. Rest is not stillness. It is continuity without collapse. The atmosphere now pressed against the surface with a confidence earned through repetition. Pressure became reliable. Heat moved through the sky and returned to the ground without violence. Cold arrived and departed without shock. Extremes softened into ranges that could be crossed without erasure. This reliability changed how Earth behaved. Stone weathered patiently, not because it was weak, but because time had finally learned how to stay with it. Minerals altered slowly, surfaces rounded, sharpness yielded to shape. The ground began to carry the marks of long exposure rather than sudden interruption. Water settled into its role. Rain fell often enough to matter, not everywhere, not always, but predictably enough to carve memory into the surface. Channels deepened where water returned again and again. Basins held longer, some dried, some refilled. Earth began to recognize itself through repetition. Air moved these waters thoughtfully, redistributing what arrived unevenly. Winds guided clouds, clouds guided rain, rain guided erosion, erosion guided shape. The planet's face began to change in ways that accumulated rather than reset. Accumulation is memory that has learned patience. The sun's light now passed through a sky that softened it reliably. Harmful radiation still reached the surface, but less often, less intensely. Some wavelengths were absorbed, others scattered. The atmosphere did not block the sun, it negotiated with it. Negotiation allowed endurance. Nitrogen, patient and unreactive, continued to provide bulk and stability. Carbon dioxide lingered, holding warmth close enough to matter. Water vapor cycled, linking sky and surface in continuous exchange. Oxygen still appeared only briefly, quickly bound away, but the surface was changing, slowly preparing for its return. Preparation does not announce itself, it repeats. The moon's steady presence continued to stretch time into usable lengths. Longer days gave air more time to move. Gentler nights allowed cooling without collapse. Rhythms stabilized not because they were perfect, but because they were forgiving. Forgiveness allows complexity. Earth was no longer a planet where every change erased the last. It had become a place where change could build upon itself. Air, water, and stone now interacted continuously, shaping one another through feedback rather than interruption. Feedback created depth. The atmosphere had learned to keep more than gas. It kept warmth. It kept water close. It kept cycles intact long enough to matter. This was not the arrival of a friendly sky, not yet. The air was still harsh, thick with carbon dioxide, poor in oxygen, dangerous to anything familiar. But it was no longer fleeting. It was no longer experimental. It was present in a way that could be relied upon. Reliability is the quiet foundation of everything that follows. Earth now carried a sky that stayed, a surface that remembered, a rhythm that repeated. What emerged next would not come from the sky alone, or the ground alone, or the depths alone. It would arise where all three met repeatedly, where chemistry lingered, where energy cycled gently so. Where time was allowed to stack its effects without being wiped away. The planet did not know this, did not anticipate. It did not choose. It simply became capable. Some stories do not begin with events, they begin with conditions that finally stop undoing themselves. The air had learned how to keep, and with that lesson complete, Earth stood on the edge of a transformation so subtle it would take billions of repetitions to be noticed. But once it began, the planet would never be the same again. Time settles again. What once rushed now repeats. What once burned now warms. What once scattered now stays. The solar system no longer speaks in events. It speaks in intervals. A cloud learned wait. Fire learned restraint. Stone learned patience. Silence learned how to hold distance. A planet learned how not to forget everything at once. A moon carried what could not yet be born. Air learned how to remain. Nothing else needs to happen. Earth turns beneath a steady sun. The moon keeps its distance. Stone holds memory without language. The sky presses lightly, consistently, enough to matter. Time does not pass here. It layers. What was once becoming has become habit. What was once chaos has softened into structure. What was once impossible has simply stopped undoing itself. Some truths are not discovered. They are endured. And the Earth, long before it could remember, learned how to stay long enough for remembering to one day be possible. The story does not end, it rests.